Sasuke, Aizen, and the Quincy King Yhwach, the two main villains of Bleach. Despite only a single on-screen interaction in the manga, I believe they share the most important dynamic in the entire story. Two revolutionaries who fought to challenge the status quo, two gods wielding powers of the divine Soul King, two schemers who took grasp of fate itself and almost became it, driving each respective half of the story, pre-time skip and post-time skip. And perhaps most importantly, the two men responsible for the spirits residing within Ichigo's soul. Today we will be taking an unbearably deep dive into the construction of these two characters and their narrative relationship. Hopefully, in doing so, I'll be able to illustrate just why I believe that they are both some of the greatest of all time. This video has been very difficult to make, as you can likely tell by how long I haven't uploaded a video. I did also have a lot of personal stuff going on over the last few months, like moving countries, but since my last upload I have reached 50,000 subscribers, and for that I want to thank each and every one of you for watching and supporting the channel. I really love making videos, and I can't begin to describe how much I appreciate you guys for not only watching them but seemingly loving them. Your support really helps the creative juices keep flowing, and it truly means the world. I probably would have stopped making videos a long time ago if it wasn't for all the support you guys provide me with. I have made a Patreon with the only real benefit of an exclusive Discord server and my 1000 Year Blood War Core 3 reaction VODs for now, but those benefits will be updated over time with anime reactions starting with Code Geass and other ideas I'll be sharing over there, but for now it's mainly just a way for you to support me even further if you so wish. Just liking the video and leaving a comment is already more than I can ask for, but for those who want to go beyond, the Patreon link is in the description. Thank you all once again, and without further ado, let's dive right into the most important dynamic in Bleach. At the center of the cosmos lies a limbless nugget that maintains balance, residing in a perpetual state of both life and death, suspended at the juncture of the 2 points in existence that define the story of Bleach. He is outside the cycle of life and death, or perhaps it would be more appropriate to say that Ryo exists above the cycle. This rumored god is an everlasting mark of the Shinigami sin in creating the current world. The all-powerful who could see thousands of years into the future and was more than capable of thwarting the noble ancestors' schemes, yet simply allowed them to seal and mutilate him, for he saw some hope in the new world. Having all his powers and organs stripped from him, rendered a husk with nothing but an almighty gaze, he waited silently, longing the inevitable day he would be struck down by Kurosaki Ichigo. The Soul King forms the foundation of Bleach, the underlying premise of the story. A search for meaning in a life where death is inescapable is facilitated by his existence. He is the ultimate enabler of the story's themes, linchpin of everything. To use a somewhat meta-analogy, Ryo functions like the paper of the manga itself, the unseen yet indispensable element that gives form to everything that exists within the story. This metaphor extends beyond just world building too. Paper is passive, a silent enabler of thoughts to be inscribed upon them, and it is fragile, susceptible to being torn, burned, or erased, and taking with it all that has been imprinted on it. Ryo too is paradoxically both essential and vulnerable. He is the cornerstone of creation, yet he exists in a state of dismembered stasis, reduced to little more than a tool to maintain order. His very passivity is what allows the world to function, but it also makes him an object to be used, controlled, and ultimately sacrificed. The universe of Bleach is, in a sense, already written upon his being. Yet should that paper be destroyed, everything written upon it, life, death, the cycle of souls, all would cease to exist. All of the races that each arc goes to great lengths to explore, all of the different powers, death itself, all of these things exist because the Ryo does. They hinge upon him. Courage in the face of death is only possible because of him. The Soul King is the very condition that makes this story possible, and this applies on many levels, including the structure of the story itself. Reo is the centerpiece of the major conflicts in both the pre-time skip and post-time skip, the being that both of the main villains of the story, Aizen and Yhwach, intend to kill and usurp as ruler of the cosmos. The supposedly omnipotent, omniscient being who lords over the universe is really just a nugget sealed within a crystal in the Shinigami's backyard, a being with all the power in the world who lacks the agency to do anything with it. That is the unbearable vacancy of Heaven's throne that Aizen wished to topple. That is the endless humiliation Yhwach wished to end. But killing the Soul King destroys the balance and in turn threatens everything Bleach stands for. For everything that exists in pairs, both sides of the spectrum are necessary for either to hold any meaning. This is known as the unity of opposites. Life and death, the beginning and the end. Light and dark, or good and evil. Each defines the other. Bleach argues that accepting this fundamental truth is the first step towards appreciating one's existence. The courage to not only embrace the inevitability of death, but to recognize the necessity of its continuance. For in this universe, death is a delicate construct, one that can be altered or even erased entirely. Both life and death are simply the shapes that existence has been placed into, the form of this world being maintained by the fragile Soul King. Yhwach wished to return things to how they were before, to break the balance of the world's current shape and remove the concept of death by killing Reo, transforming the shape of existence into one of perfect life. A world where all fear would simply disappear, as all fear ultimately stems from a fear of death. But without fear, people will not search for hope. Without being grounded by death as a destination, life becomes aimless, empty, stagnant. The fatal flaw in Yhwach's utopia is its perfection. By eliminating all negatives, the positives stop being positive. Perfection is a dead end that leaves no room for innovation or improvement or wisdom or talent, because all things are colored by contrast and perfection is whole, with no equal opposite. Yhwach could not see that life must lead to death for it to hold value. Without death to ground existence, life becomes hollow. This is obviously not the most unique idea out there, but that's the answer Bleach ultimately reaches, and it does so using balance as its language. The aforementioned unity of opposites is what Bleach designs itself after, thematically, aesthetically, structurally, and all of it can only exist with Reo as the cornerstone of the story, the symbol of balance, the same Reo who Aizen and Yhwach threaten to destroy, the same Reo who was created to give way to a potential for progress, among other reasons of course. Reo is the beating heart that allows Bleach's universe to remain in a state of flux, in a perpetual state of becoming, with change as the only real constant. There is no better place to truly begin this video than with Ichigo himself. What makes the Aizen and Yhwach dynamic one of unparalleled importance is how the two main villains intersect in the construction of our main character. They serve as the architects of Ichigo's destiny, manipulating the course of his life for their own means, thus becoming the crushing wheel of fate he wishes to shatter, and there is a great deal to extrapolate from both the similarities and differences in their approaches. These two are not merely antagonists in Bleach, they are authors of Ichigo's story, imposing their own designs upon him, turning him into their instrument. In doing so, they highlight the very struggle at the core of his character, the desire to break free from a destiny imposed upon him. In a metafictional sense, Aizen and Yhwach represent different modes of storytelling, writing the script of Ichigo's life. Aizen, the illusionist, is the deliberate plotter, meticulously crafting Ichigo's path through intricate manipulations. Yhwach, on the other hand, is the inevitable force of narrative itself, an omnipresent will that steers Ichigo without even trying. One is the cunning scriptwriter, orchestrating the journey from behind the scenes, and the other is the hand of fate hovering above, weaving the story naturally, as if it could have never gone any other way. The ultimate distinction between the two lies in their intent. The Quincy King occupies the place in the story Aizen sought had he not been lying to himself about his motivations. Aizen tries to be the hand of fate, to stand at the pinnacle and dictate the course of existence, but he is, at his core, a pretender, but a reflection of the moon on the water's surface, his illusions extending beyond Kyoku Suigetsu, as his very self is a mirage, a being who claims to stand above all yet is ultimately subject to the same wheel of time and fate as everybody else. He masquerades as a wielder of fate, but in truth he is simply an exceptionally gifted manipulator, navigating the tides rather than commanding them. Yhwach, in stark contrast as this high-concept force of nature antagonist, can only truly be described as the walking, talking personification of fate. His omniscience and omnipotence are not the result of careful planning and scheming, but the natural state of his existence. He does not orchestrate events, he is the force that makes them unfold. Ichigo's entire journey, every trial he endured, every battle he fought, was already aligned with Yhwach's desired outcome. Where Aizen carefully guides Ichigo through a predetermined path, Yhwach merely waits, knowing that whatever path Ichigo takes will lead straight to him. There's one very key parallel that perfectly illustrates the contrast I just outlined, the mirror scenes of chapter 396 and 619. In 396, Aizen shatters Ichigo's perception of his own agency by revealing that every major event in his life, the arrival of Fishbone D, the appearance of Menos Grande, Rukia's assignment to Karakura, the detection of Rukia's spiritual energy, etc., everything was orchestrated by him. He was the unseen manipulator guiding Ichigo's growth, meticulously placing each piece on the board so that Ichigo would unknowingly serve his design. Aizen is a craftsman, carefully constructing a protagonist to walk a path he lays out for him. He played an active role in shaping the course of Ichigo's life, placing a great deal of effort in making Ichigo do exactly what he wanted him to do. In 619, Yhwach distinguishes himself from Aizen, whilst paradoxically stealing his whole flow almost word for word, bar for bar. Just look at the presentation in these two scenes as the main villain recounts our protagonist's journey thus far. Yhwach reducing Aizen to just another part of this journey, rather than the endpoint he so desperately tried to be, places him on an even greater pedestal than the former big bad. Yhwach recounts Ichigo's journey and growth in power just like Aizen did, however he asserts something even more terrifying than Aizen's hidden orchestrations. The fact he never needed to orchestrate anything. Unlike Aizen, who had to manipulate and deceive, Yhwach's control is intrinsic, an inevitability that requires zero effort. Every choice Ichigo made, every struggle he endured, every growth in power he experienced, it was all for Yhwach's benefit, not by careful design, but by the sheer nature of his existence. Yhwach did not need to write Ichigo's story, he was the story. Let me elaborate even further. Yhwach was sealed and lacked the power to do anything. He was a silent observer who, upon regaining his agency, immediately makes use of an Ichigo who had already been sculpted by his experiences with Aizen. In a sense, you could say he steals the control over Ichigo's story from Aizen. But once again, there was no active effort needed on his part. He didn't go and take the pen out of Aizen's hand, it simply showed up in his. Without even having to think, every single thing Ichigo had done his entire journey was done for Yhwach's gain, simply by virtue of his existence as the Quincy King, as one whose blood is flowing in all Quincy. Yhwach has domain over Ichigo's soul and, through Old Man Zangetsu, unknowingly guided him down the course of events that ultimately resulted resulted in Ichigo slaying the Soul King for Yhwach's benefit. The ultimate example of this lies in the emotional bedrock of the entire narrative, the death of Masaki. Yhwach did not target Ichigo's mother specifically, nor did he select the time to perform the Ashvalen when she was in combat. Those circumstances just happened to align with the Kaiser Gesang prophecy. You see what I'm saying? That is the key difference between Aizen and Yhwach, a man who must resort to elaborate schemes to achieve desired results, versus a god who simply observes from the shadows, getting what he wants without even needing to try. You can think of their relationship in this context as the difference between determinism and fatalism. Aizen obviously operates under the former. His philosophy is one of active control. Fate is not an unchangeable endpoint when Aizen is concerned, but rather a path that can be constructed through cause and effect. Yhwach embodies fatalism. He is the decider of all fates, and no one can deviate from what is reflected upon his eyes. Or, if we want to stick with the meta reading of their characters, you can think of them as the difference between an architect and a gardener, as per George Martin's famous quote. Aizen, the architect, plans everything ahead of time. He has it all designed and blueprinted out before even driving in the first nail. Yhwach, on the other hand, is a gardener. He plants a seed, he knows what kind of tree it's going to grow into, and he just allows things to unfold naturally, fully confident it's going to result in a fate that serves him. But even Yhwach is not infallible. There is a hierarchy of sorts within the Wheel of Fate, and Yhwach had his efforts thwarted by his own father shortly after having done the same to his son. Ukitake's sacrifice allows for the intervention of Mimihagi, a piece of the Reo that doesn't reflect upon the eyes of the Almighty, which throws a wrench in Yhwach's script and forces him to consume and become Reo himself. I edited an incredible video over on Craftsdwarf's channel on the defeat of Yhwach that goes into all the factors that coalesce in overcoming Yhwach's control over the narrative, so I highly recommend watching that if you're interested in a more elaborate breakdown. Bleach is a story about many things, and one of those is fighting against imposed fate. Aizen and Yhwach facilitate this narrative through authorial control. If Aizen is the scheming author controlling the story's flow, Yhwach is the story itself, declaring that there was never any other path but this. And yet, both Aizen and Yhwach, despite their attempts to dictate reality, are ultimately thwarted by forces beyond their comprehension. Aizen, in his arrogance, failed to understand that his control was never as absolute as he believed, his own schemes ultimately leading to his downfall, with Ichigo reaching an unfathomable level of power beyond Aizen's wildest dreams, with Aizen himself causing this by killing the Kototsu and gifting Ichigo a hyperbolic time chamber. Yhwach, for all his omnipotence, was blind to the things that lay outside his perception, the intervention of Mimihagi, and of course the ultimate karmic justice provided by the silver arrow that facilitates Ichigo's final strike. Yhwach had his fate sealed by the very Quincy whose powers and lives he stole. Their suffering crystallized into the one weapon that could return the favor and strip him of his own power. The god who claimed to control fate fell to the consequences of his own cruelty through a weapon that embodies the main theme of the story, literally formed by the silver that remains in the hearts of the Ashvalen victims. Even the scriptwriter can be rewritten and overcome. In Everything But the Rain, Aizen's role in Ichigo's life is finally clarified and properly communicated to us. It is exposed that he wasn't truly behind everything as he claimed to be, rather an opportunist adapting to fate's design. The White incident was completely coincidental, and Aizen simply adapted to the course of events, curious of what fate had in store. And the union between Masaki and Isshin's souls eventually gave birth to Ichigo, and within him, White, the perfect fusion of Shinigami and Hollow. Aizen's efforts have led to several failures. From the Vizards to the Arrancar, he is consistently disappointed by all of his research subjects in an effort to better understand the world and to sublimate the soul to a higher dimension. And so, it is very fitting that his greatest ever accomplishment, the one thing Aizen had sought all along, the perfect fusion of Shinigami and Hollow, is something he barely had any contribution towards. At first, he dismisses White as a disappointment. It wasn't even named by him, but rather by Torsen. And the process of White becoming the spirit we meet in the dark side of the universe was a convoluted miracle Aizen had a little part in. The stars aligned to make this happen. White chose to merge with a Quincy, the existence furthest from itself, and while this should have surely spelled doom, Masaki managed to survive thanks to Isshin's ridiculous, irrational decision to protect her for the rest of his life, relinquishing everything with nothing to gain besides following his heart and protecting. While Aizen may rule Hueco Mundo as its king, seemingly having conquered the hollow condition, as he labels them with various aspects of death that serve him, as if they're all beneath him, as if death itself is beneath him, his greatest achievement in breaking the boundary between Shinigami and hollows belongs to Ichigo, a Quincy and Shinigami sacrificing their lives for each other, and a hollow choosing to merge with a Quincy. Ichigo is a product of inexplicable anomalies that defy natural law. That is why Aizen was so excited, so obsessed, and why he goes to such extremes to manipulate the course of Ichigo's life from that moment onwards. Aizen's manner of thinking is generally aligned with an appreciation of death and fate, yearning for godhood yet wholly attuned to the core facets of humanity. He values fear as a necessary prerequisite for evolution. He flows with the wheel of fate as one who embraces curiosity, because Aizen's aspirations of godhood are a smokescreen, a self-imposed delusion and disguise masking his true desires. He doesn't actually exist on a higher plane to the other characters, rather he is a participant in the same existential struggle that everybody faces. Yet, it's not so much of a struggle for Aizen. He thrives within their collective condition, ultimately being the one to deliver the final say of the story once he finally comes to appreciate the courage he was once capable of possessing. Unfortunately for him, he could only gain this appreciation in remembrance, having cursed himself with immortality. Yhwach, all-seeing, can never be curious. All futures are reflected upon his eyes, and once he consumes and becomes the Soul King, he is truly all-powerful, gaining the ability to alter the futures he observes in whatever manner he wishes, grasping hold of and becoming the scriptwriter of everybody's lives in a world where the future does not lie on a single path, turning a world that can be shaped by people's wills into one dictated by his singular will. But in the end, after putting up one of the villain performances of the century, even the ridiculous control of Yhwach is finally overcome by the collective defiance of so many who challenge the fate he wields and fight to protect the current world, with its presence of death and equally its potential for both good and evil, this world of constant flux. I spoke about the unity of opposites earlier in the video, and of all the opposites explored within the story, there is none more significant than progression and stagnation. Now, you may be wondering, what makes them polar opposites? Surely regression would make more sense as the counterpart to progression, and technically speaking, that is correct, especially linguistically. But words are multifaceted and sometimes fickle. Within the context of Bleach, this isn't the right way to frame things. This is a story that goes out of its way to consistently showcase both sides of the spectrum, a narrative built on the idea that perspective shapes reality. And so, what one person views as progression can be viewed as regression by another. It's ultimately entirely subjective. To make things more easily discernible and tangible, so to speak, Bleach operates within a much simpler framework, one that is very cut and dry. Progression is the presence of change, whether positive or negative, and stagnation is simply the absence of change. Imagine an hourglass. There is no correct way for an hourglass to face. There are two opposite sides that do the exact same thing. You cannot determine whether the sand is progressing or regressing because all that truly matters is the movement, the presence of change. As long as the sand is flowing, change is happening. The true opposite of this is not an hourglass flipped upside down, but one lying on its side, frozen, with the grains of sand suspended in stillness. That is stagnation, the death of movement, the absence of any change. In Bleach, stagnation is the enemy. Above all, the story advocates for movement, to never stop walking, and the direction of that movement, whether forward or backward, whether one is progressing or regressing, will always be a matter of perspective. That's what the final message of the story is all about. Ichigo chooses to maintain the current world as it is a world with the potential for change. Even if that change could be for the worst, it is still preferable to Ichigo over a world of monotonous stillness with no potential to change. Because no matter how bad things may become, as long as movement exists, so too does the possibility of hope. That's the underlying idea behind courage and Kazui's significance. Ichigo's choice to bring a life into the world and have a family, to continue the cycle of life and change and progress. To have a child is Ichigo's response to Yhwach in the final chapter. The main reason I refer to this dichotomy as one of progress versus stagnation is once again because of the Soul King, the being I previously described as the linchpin of the entire narrative, the one who facilitates the union of opposites that Bleach designs itself after, literally contains both sides of this dichotomy within him in the form of his two arms. Panaida and Mimihagi are analogous to the thematic conflict of the Thousand-Year Blood War, the left arm representative of progress siding with the Quincy, and the right arm representative of stagnation siding with the Shinigami. But upon further inspection, the goals of their factions are the exact opposite of what these hands embody. While Yhwach and the Wandenreich do represent a form of change and progress in their goal of reverting the world into what it once was, i.e. regression, the world they wish to create is one of complete stagnancy. And while the Shinigami absolutely represent a form of stagnation in their goal of trying to maintain the current world and in a bunch of other things as well, they are doing so because the status quo is one with the potential for progress, one with a future. Another large-scale example would be the entire conflict of the Soul Society arc, where the clash between stagnation and progression takes center stage. The likes of Yamamoto and Byakuya embody a rigid adherence to the law, representing a system unwilling to challenge its norms, and they butt heads against Shunsui, Ukitake, and obviously Ichigo himself, who all embody the spirit of change, challenging the status quo in their willingness to fight against established norms. By the arc's conclusion, it is revealed that the character most defined by progress in the entire story had orchestrated the course of events leading to Rukia's execution, using Ichigo as an unwitting pawn to divert the Shinigami's attention as he begins his crusade. Aizen doesn't simply challenge the system, he weaponizes the stagnancy of Soul Society against its followers, murdering and impersonating Central 46 to seize complete control over those aforementioned complacent abiders of the law. A smaller scale and more focused example of this dichotomy would be the entire trajectory of Mayuri's character arc and how this conflict is explored through the lens of science and creation. When we meet him, he is utterly disinterested in Uryu, believing his research on Quincy was complete, in essence perfect, only to have that notion completely dismantled by Uryu's performance in the battle. Not only did Uryu perform Ransou Tengai, an ability Mayuri knew of but had never seen, but he defeats Mayuri using the Let Steel, which was only possible thanks to the Leiden Hunt, a glove that was taken from the Wandenreich by his grandfather Sorkin. Mayuri was literally defeated by an object that comes from the Quincy Empire that is silently hiding in the shadows, preparing for their eventual assault, and the glove served as proof that Mayuri's research is nowhere near complete. It's safe to say he learns his lesson, as the next time we see Mayuri in the Arrancar saga, he has undergone a fundamental shift and has come to abhor perfection. Never again will he believe his research is perfect. Never again will he be a slave of his expectations. He has learnt his lesson and left stagnancy behind in a never-ending quest for progress. Of course, the Thousand-Year Blood War comes around and Mayuri's true feelings are uncovered, a hypocrisy unveiled, as the one who scorned perfection had actually been stuck in a long dream all this time. The battle between Mayuri and Panaida is a beast of its own, and there's a video coming out on that very soon, so we're going to be moving on, but I hope I've sufficiently communicated the importance and prevalence of progression versus stagnation as a central pillar of Bleach's narrative framework. While I won't always mention it directly, it's gonna be important moving forward. Why did Aizen want to stand atop Heaven's throne? It's undeniable that he harbors a great deal of contempt for the Soul King's existence, but is that really all? What led him down the path of seeking godhood and ruling above all? There's no better place to start than the beginning. Aizen was born immensely powerful, more powerful than anybody around him, and a common trend in the world of Bleach is that immense power is isolating and often leads to loneliness. Toshiro's power made him an outcast. He scared people away and had no friends besides Momo in his childhood. He was literally killing his grandmother due to his uncontrolled power until he was fortunate enough to meet Rangiku and decided to become a Shinigami. Stark was so powerful that simply being around him would create hordes of corpses, leading him to literally split his soul and create a companion out of Lilynet to quell the pains of solitude. Kenpachi takes the idea of battle as a means of communication to its extreme, creating hordes of corpses just like Stark as he wandered the slums of the Rukongai aimlessly. The battles he had engaged in meant nothing. It was like swinging his sword in darkness. Kenpachi was incapable of connecting with anybody through battle because everybody was just too damn weak until he met Unohana. All of these examples give us a good window into how the beginning of Aizen's journey may have looked, only he didn't have a guiding light, no Rangiku or Unohana to connect him to the rest of the world. However, this is just half of the picture. It's not just immense power that isolated Aizen. This is mostly speculation, but before Aizen came to learn the truth of the Soul King, I believe he had hopes that Ryo could be his equal. In fact, that may be how he came to discover the original sin in the first place. A fervent desire to meet, battle, and form a heart with the pinnacle of existence led him down a path of research that ended in crushing disappointment. The entity he sought, the one who should have been above all others, was nothing more than a mutilated husk sealed in a crystal. That may be why Aizen despises Ryo's existence as much as he does on such a personal level. He felt betrayed by his only chance for a match, his only chance for connection, upon learning he's just a nugget sealed in a crystal. Upon discovering this truth, Aizen's quest for ascension began. He would enact a form of vengeance upon the Shinigami who robbed him of his only chance to form a connection. While we can't exactly confirm this, it's the trajectory that makes the most sense to me with all the information we have to work with. Like I said though, immense power is just half of the picture. Even more fitting as a parallel to Aizen's loneliness than the likes of Toshiro, Stark, and Kenpachi is none other than the protagonist himself. Aizen is, in many ways, the Ichigo who never met Rukia. What isolated them wasn't just immense power, but the burden of seeing what others could not. Ichigo grew up feeling disconnected from the world, haunted by the spirits only he could perceive. His very ability to see became a source of alienation. Likewise, Aizen possessed a vision beyond his peers, that the world was built atop deception. He alone saw through the illusion of the Soul King and the fallacy of the Shinigami. Ichigo's meeting with Rukia was more than just the catalyst for the story, it was the moment he was freed from loneliness. His ability to see spirits had always been a curse for him, an invisible wall separating him from the rest of the world. He lived in a reality that no one else could understand, burdened by things no one else could see. I understand that Karin could also see ghosts, but Ichigo does not confide in her. He viewed himself as her protector and didn't want to burden his younger sister with his problems. But then Rukia appeared. For the first time in his life, Ichigo wasn't alone in what he could see. She didn't just acknowledge the ghost he had spent years pretending not to see, she lived in a world where that sight was the norm and introduced Ichigo to that world. Like those aforementioned guiding lights, Rukia connected Ichigo to the rest of the world. Aizen never had that moment of liberation. Like Ichigo, he too saw beyond the surface of reality, but he never found somebody who could see things the way he did. The truth did not free him, it isolated him further, convincing him that he alone was above a world of blind fools. That's why Kisuke gets under his skin and aggravates him beyond belief. They stand shoulder to shoulder. Kisuke understands who Aizen is and yet denounces all that he is. Luckily for Aizen, Ichigo comes along, the perfect research subject and perhaps more importantly, a potential solution to Aizen's loneliness. I want to reiterate once again that Aizen's immense power is not the sole reason for his isolation. This is a widespread misconception in the fanbase, an oversimplification that does more harm than good when assessing his character. A common rebuttal to this notion comes in the form of very understandable questions. If Aizen's core struggle was simply being stronger than everyone, why does he concede that Yamamoto might surpass him in combat? Why does he resort to Wandenreich instead of facing Yamamoto head on? If all he wanted was an equal in power, why not fight to the death? These are all valid points under the assumption that Aizen's isolation stems purely from his strength, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. Aizen's loneliness does not come from power alone. While his immense strength is a major factor, the true source of his isolation lies in his knowledge and the way he perceives the world. What Aizen truly longed for was not just an equal in strength, but someone who could see what he saw, someone who understood his perspective. His first poem expresses this better than I ever could. He seeks to be the flower on the precipice, the one who transcends fear and ventures into the unknown. Those who stop at the cliff's edge are bound by fear, by limitations, by the structures that govern their existence. Aizen refuses to be constrained by such things. He wants to go beyond, to the very edge of reason. But no one else shares this perspective. No one in the Soul Society dares to. That is the true source of his loneliness. His immense power merely exacerbates it. Aizen's relationship with Ichigo is fascinating and conflicting. He effectively grooms him into power for two opposing reasons. On one hand, Ichigo represents Aizen's answer to loneliness, a potential equal who could stand on the same plane as him, someone who might finally understand his anguish and grant him the connection he never had. Ichigo's very existence as the perfect fusion of all races makes him a Soul King candidate. It's entirely possible that Aizen molded Ichigo as a replacement to Ryo after having felt betrayed by the truth of his condition, and whether or not this was a conscious decision or something Aizen performed unknowingly, the outcome remains the same. Aizen, in his own way, was trying to create a friend in Ichigo. On the other hand, Aizen seeks to kill Ichigo, to surpass this Ryo candidate at their very best, in an attempt to validate his belief that the natural order is a fallacy. You can see this belief demonstrated at the start of chapter 407, as Aizen and Gin traverse through the Dangai and are approached by the Kototsu, a creature that governs space-time, a creature of reason. Gin, adhering to the logic of the world, claims that it's not something that can be handled by spiritual energy. This is what he understandably believes to be the natural order of the world. This is a fact to him, something that need not be questioned, like the earth being round or Bleach falling off after Soul Society. And Aizen responds by handling the Kototsu with his spiritual energy, dispelling that fact and creating a new truth, ending the exchange with an all-encompassing quote: "Reason is but a shield for those who cower behind it. Well, shall we, to the edge of reason?" Remember, Aizen is on his way to the Soul Society to create an Oken and head to the Ryokyu, which is the edge of reason in this context, the cornerstone of the world where Ryo and Squad Zero reside, the deciders of the laws of the universe, laws that Aizen no longer needs to abide by with his transcendent power. And so, crushing Ichigo at the peak of his power, this perfect fusion that reason would suggest should be Aizen's superior, is effectively no different to his destruction of the Kototsu, a rebellion against the natural order of the world, an affirmation of his belief that reason is just a social construct used to manipulate the masses and shackle society. Of course, what transpires isn't so kind to Aizen. Ichigo absolutely embarrasses him and transcends to a plane even further beyond the same Aizen who is incomprehensible to the likes of Gin, Kisuke, and Isshin. But regardless of his defeat, Aizen's subconscious wishes are answered. A heart is formed between him and Ichigo. For the first time, Aizen is viewed as just a normal person, with a past and history of his own, with experiences that shaped his worldview and turned him into the person he is today, with pain and longing buried beneath layers of power and ambition. Ichigo looks beyond the roles assigned upon Aizen, beyond the tough exterior and the masks he adorns himself with, and he sees the crying child locked inside. Aizen's introduction in chapter 79 has him challenge the judgment of Central 46 and their decision to execute Rukia for what seems like a minor offense, despite having been the one to orchestrate this entire chain of events. In a way, he's almost challenging Renji and the reader to figure him out. This iteration of Aizen, the kind, compassionate captain of the 5th Division, whom I'll refer to as simply Captain Aizen, is fundamentally no different to the villain Aizen who we spend the rest of pre-time skip with. with. Both are personas, characters he plays through carefully crafted performances. Neither are the real Sasuke Aizen, but both of them are reflections of his true self, rather than separate false identities. There are fragments of truth within the lie that Captain Aizen lived, and I'd argue that this version of Aizen achieves what he had always wanted to some extent. It's not as clear-cut as Old Man Zangetsu and Yhwach, who I'll be exploring in the next section, but there are elements of Captain Aizen that clearly resemble the version of him at the end of the series, which is the closest thing to his ideal self. In a nutshell, Captain Aizen is a person who had found balance and harmony within the world. He found peace within the stagnant framework of Soul Society, through the act of cultivating others to push forward rather than dismantling the system outright. Unlike Ichigo, these aren't science projects he orchestrates from the shadows. Captain Aizen actively nurtures the next generation through personal, genuine connections. The perfect metaphor for this is Aizen's role as a teacher of calligraphy at the Shinigami Academy. Aizen is literally teaching others to write, a rather direct reflection of his philosophy and what he wants for all people. To question the world, to find holes within the narratives imposed upon them, and to take hold of the pen and shape their own truths. What's important to note is that even if Aizen's heart was never in it, even if his kindness was a calculated facade and his intentions were the furthest thing from pure, the impact of his actions are undeniable. For over a century, Aizen played the part of a good person, mentoring, guiding, and uplifting those around him. That time, that influence, cannot be erased simply because it was all an act. He may claim that the Sasuke Aizen they knew never existed, but he did, whether he likes it or not. There's obviously a new complexion now. It's not exactly the same as it was prior to the reveal of his deception, but what he put out into the world cannot be taken away. Aizen's words in his introduction plant seeds of doubts that function as the linchpin of Renji's Soul Society character arc. His decision to stand in defiance against Shinigami customs and follow his heart is facilitated by Aizen's subtle manipulations, and that's obviously a very positive change for Renji. Aizen carefully maneuvers Momo, Shuhei, and Izuru into positions that serve his own ends, ensuring he could keep a close eye on the next generation. Yet in doing so, he inadvertently set them on their paths of eventual actualization. By placing them under the command of captains who would profoundly alter their lives, he unwittingly facilitates the very thing he sought to control, their personal evolution. None of their character arcs would have unfolded in the way they did without Aizen's interference. His calculated moves, meant to keep them within the palm of his hand, instead propelled them forward. He became the catalyst for their development. A recurring motif throughout the story is that of the right and left hand paths. Many cultures have this distinction between the right side and the left side, particularly in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Western occultism. The right-hand path is generally associated with an adherence to social norms, tradition, and a strict sense of morality. And to nobody's surprise, the left-hand path exists in stark contrast. It is about breaking free from imposed structures, transgression, and self-deification. While the right-hand path emphasizes collectivism and divine union, the left-hand path is all about individualism and self-elevation. This is integrated absolutely everywhere in Bleach, particularly in the dichotomy between preservation and transformation, or simply stagnation and progress. Mimihagi and Panaida take this motif that was largely subtextual and make it very explicit with their inclusion in the story, physicalizing these concepts. Mimihagi, the right hand, is a force of complete stillness. It stabilizes and preserves, halting the spread of Ukitake's sickness for the majority of his life. And Panaida, the left hand, is a force of unbridled evolution. It mutates everything it touches, forcing change in contrast to its counterpart, which freezes everything in place. Another representation of this dichotomy can be found in the opposing philosophies of Mayuri Kurotsuchi and Jushiro Ukitake. Kubo makes a very explicit association between Mayuri and the left-hand path, not only in having him face off against Panaida, but in this cover that depicts Mayuri as Baphomet, the patron saint of the left-hand path in Western occultism. Mayuri is amoral. He has zero standards. He is constantly defying the ethical norms of Soul Society to push the boundaries of knowledge. He views perfection, which is synonymous with stagnation in this context, as the greatest despair, a fate worse than death for scientists such as himself. There is no greater joy for Mayuri Kurotsuchi than continuous transformation, no matter how grotesque. Ukitake, the host of Mimihagi, is the polar opposite. He is virtuous and principled, staunchly abiding by a strict moral code, and he is one of the ultimate upholders of the status quo, willingly sacrificing his life to preserve the current world. Of course, there are nuances to both of these characters that place them on the opposing ends as well. In the Soul Society arc, Ukitake challenges the social norms of Soul Society, and as I discussed earlier in the video, Soul Society Mayuri was stagnant in ways he did not comprehend. Aizen is the ultimate transgressor of order within Bleach, deeply aligned with the left-hand path. And as a transcendent being with aspirations of dismantling the existing structure and imposing his own world with its own vision of order, he mirrors the Soul King, whether consciously or not, by having his own two hands, Tosen and Gin. However, unlike the Soul King's hands, Panaida and Mimihagi, which embody clear-cut concepts of progression and stagnation, Aizen's hands are two human individuals, far more complex and fluid in their roles. The tragedy of the Soul King lies in the fact that his hands, like the rest of his fragmented body, can be so easily boxed into simple concepts. They are objectified and reduced to mere functions rather than autonomous entities. That isn't to say Panaida and Mimihagi are not sentient beings, because they clearly are. However, they are treated as mere instruments of higher forces, both by the characters within the story and by the narrative itself. Aizen's two hands are functioning, living people. They cannot be neatly categorized into rigid binaries of left and right, progression and stagnation. Unlike the literal inhuman hands of Reo, Gin and Tosen are human. My interpretation of which hand each of them embodies is fluid, as they both contain aspects of both the right hand and the left hand. Initially, I saw Tosen as the right hand and Gin as the left, but upon further inspection, especially through the lens of progression and stagnation, the opposite makes a little more sense to me. Tosen aligns more naturally with the left-hand path when viewing his motivations. He serves Aizen because he seeks change. He desires to serve the new world that Aizen will create, whatever that may be. And the most damning evidence of his association to the left-hand path is his holification and transformation, something Gin deliberately never undergoes. On the other hand, pun intended, we have Gin, who has no interest in progress. He cares only for Rangiku and enacting vengeance upon Aizen. His entire existence is centered around a single unchanging purpose, and it has been since he was a child. And he tries to swallow Aizen whole like the snake he is, an act which is mirrored by the right-hand Mimihagi, who tries to consume Yhwach much later in the story. As Aizen himself states, he has never considered anyone but Gin to be his lieutenant or right-hand man. Tosen envisioned the future for himself as the Archangel of Justice, while Gin expected to die in his attempt to slay Aizen. So broadly speaking, Tosen is the left hand and Gin is the right hand. However, I'd like to reiterate that these are not strict categorizations and rather more like simple generalizations. Tosen has strong ties to the right hand path, particularly in his rigid sense of justice. His Bankai deprives enemies of all their senses besides touch, trapping them in an empty, pitch black hell where they are left to feel nothing but the pain he inflicts. It represents a sadistic, controlled order where its victims are locked in submission, a state of complete stagnation. And it could be argued that his entire existence is centered around a single, unchanging purpose, just like Gin. Similarly, Gin embodies many qualities of the left-hand path. He operates in a morally ambiguous space, with a complete disregard for conventional norms. He's conniving, deceptive, and manipulative. All are traits associated with the left hand. The main reason I'm attempting to categorize Aizen's closest subordinates into right and left is just because of how this framework interacts with Yhwach's own dynamic with his two hands. Just like Gin and Tosen, Yhwach's right and left hands, while difficult to strictly categorize, are very deeply tied to the broader themes of stagnation and progress, mirroring and contrasting Aizen in fascinating ways. The most important takeaway is that they both have these dynamics with two men who serve as the two hands of the king. What if Aizen truly yearned to sit atop Heaven's throne and wasn't just massively coping about his loneliness and lack of connections? Answering that question is one of the many functions of Yhwach. The fundamental paradox at the core of Yhwach's character is his deep-seated hatred of death, despite his very existence being predicated on the deaths of others. His ability to survive is intrinsically dependent on the cycle of distributing fragments of his soul and reclaiming them through the deaths of his followers. Simply put, the man who seeks to end the cycle of life and death relies on it to live. This contradiction is not a personal affliction, but something deeply embedded in the fabric of reality itself, specifically the world created by his father, the Soul King. Yhwach's ultimate goal of merging the realms is very likely a direct response to this condition he was born with. He seeks to rewrite existence, not merely out of a desire for conquest, but to liberate himself from the limitations imposed upon him by the natural order. His vision of a world without the distinction between life and death is a desperate attempt to escape his own existential predicament. Born blind, deaf, mute, and paralyzed, he was a child with no means of survival. And yet, those around him revered him as a divine entity all the same, calling him by the name of God, a being who ascended to omnipotence and omniscience yet was introduced to existence as a defenseless mortal. This juxtaposition, God and man, omnipotence and helplessness, shapes not only Yhwach's worldview but the very mechanics of his existence. He is bound to an endless cycle of giving and taking, a process that prolongs his life but simultaneously underscores his greatest weakness, his intrinsic fear of death. His grand ambition, the erasure of life and death as separate entities, it is all an act of self-preservation. Whilst Aizen's greatest struggle was the loneliness wrought by his immense power that isolated him from others, Yhwach's power makes it so that he cannot be lonely. His very existence depends on others. A Quincy is anybody who contains a piece of Yhwach's soul within them, and when they die, he reabsorbs their essence, making him literally connected to an entire race of people. Whilst Aizen values individualism above all, Yhwach is a representation of collectivism, for he is incapable of even having an individual identity. The soul pieces he gives out and reabsorbs as a means of survival contain the knowledge, emotions, and experiences of those Quincy, making him less of a singular entity and more of a collective consciousness. Yhwach is all Quincy, and all Quincy are Yhwach. Yhwach's unofficial introduction comes in the form of Old Man Zangetsu, a spectral manifestation of the Quincy King residing within Ichigo's soul. He attempts to introduce himself as Yhwach, but this proves futile, as Ichibe's interference censors his name and prevents it from reaching both Ichigo and the reader. The spirit would go on to take the name of Ichigo's Zanpakuto, Zangetsu, for his own, stealing a name in response to having his own stolen in mirror fashion to how his original soul acquired the name of Yhwach. Much like how Captain Aizen was a carefully constructed persona that still contained fragments of truth, Old Man Zangetsu is not a complete falsehood, but rather a reflection of Yhwach's true self from 1,000 years ago. A remnant of his past that has, in a way, been born again within Ichigo's soul. As he would later explain, he is Yhwach and he is not Yhwach. All Quincy come from Yhwach as their father. They carry a piece of his soul within them, and because Ichigo is a hybrid who has an inner realm thanks to his Shinigami heritage, that piece of Yhwach's soul within him is able to manifest as an autonomous spirit. While Old Man Zangetsu does stem from Yhwach, he does not share his consciousness. Instead, he functions as a divergent self, a splinter of the Quincy King who, having experienced the world through Ichigo's perspective, has evolved into something separate. In this sense, he can be thought of as an alternate timeline, branching away from the original source and developing into a new entity shaped by Ichigo's existence. As Ichigo's Zanpakuto spirit for much of the story, Old Man Zangetsu serves as the guiding force behind his development. Before the revelation of his true nature, the role of Old Man Zangetsu appeared to be that of a mentor. He trains Ichigo, protects him in battle, shares his own power with him. Yet beneath this facade lies a painful truth, hiding in plain sight. While Aizen, the calligraphy teacher, granted people the ability to write their own stories, OMZ quite literally held Ichigo's pen for him, masquerading as his Zanpakuto spirit and positioning himself at the center of Ichigo's soul to exert complete control over his power. Rather than guiding Ichigo towards self-actualization, he sought to limit his growth, dictating what he could and couldn't access in an attempt to keep him from fully embracing the path of a Shinigami. His reasoning? A desperate attempt to prevent a future where he might one day be forced to kill Ichigo himself. Old Man Zangetsu is a force of stagnation within Ichigo's life, holding him back from growth out of fear of death, fear of change. Beneath all of the old man's actions is an incessant need for self-preservation, but in the end, Ichigo's unwavering resolve breaks through. The old man relinquishes his grip on Ichigo's fate, no longer the hand that writes his story, but instead becoming the ink, one of his zanpakuto, the instrument that Ichigo uses to forge his own path and reject fates imposed upon him. And in doing so, the piece of Yhwach within Ichigo conquers the same fear of death that has entirely consumed his original self. Glasses, or just eyewear in general, are often used as a symbol of concealment, obscuring the truth as eyes are considered the window to the soul, particularly in Bleach. Aizen wore glasses as part of his disguise in Soul Society and destroyed them when he revealed his true nature. Likewise, Old Man Zangetsu wears a visor, while Yhwach does not, the removal of eyewear marking a grand revelation for both of the main antagonists. Aizen dramatically crushes his glasses at the end of Soul Society as he makes the bold declaration that he alone will stand at the top, whilst Old Man Zangetsu's visor naturally fades away, dissolving into the rain that falls upon Masaki in the previous volume cover. Masaki's life was taken because of the Ashvalen that rained down upon her. This is why Old Man Zangetsu hates the rain. He feels guilty, knowing his original soul is the source of Ichigo's greatest despair, the death of his mother. Just as Aizen mirrors the Soul King by having two distinct hands, Yhwach also follows this dynamic with Yugaram Hashvalt and Uryu Ishida. At first glance, it may seem natural to assign Yugaram as the right hand and Uryu as the left hand, especially since Yhwach explicitly refers to Yugaram as his right arm. However, when viewed through the lens of Quincy ideology and Yhwach's vision for the world, Yugaram actually embodies progress while Uryu represents stagnation, making things difficult to strictly categorize, much like it was for Tosen and Gin under Aizen. Regardless, this rigid binary of right and left is just a framework. What truly matters are the parallels between these relationships and, by extension, the deeper thematic links between Yhwach and Aizen themselves. Yugaram and Uryu are very deliberately excluded from the rest of their organization in a similar fashion to Gin and Tosen. The latter are literally not a part of the Espada, which makes for a much simpler argument. However, Yugaram is in a special position as Grand Master of the Stern Ritter, who serves the position of Emperor in Yhwach's stead at night time, and Uryu is literally Yhwach's successor. Towards the climax of the 1,000-Year Blood War, where most of the Stern Ritter have been killed, the final forces are Yhwach's 4 Ryu guards in their own special group, and then Yugaram and Uryu. Yugaram aligns closely with the left hand, not in the sense of rebelling against Quincy norms as he's the ultimate enforcer of them, but in his unwavering devotion to Yhwach's vision of a new world, just like Tosen had for Aizen. Loyalty to Yhwach's will represents the path of progress. The Quincy's entire goal is the destruction of existing structures to make way for a deathless utopia. And most importantly, he shares the Almighty with Yhwach. He is given the mask of the ruler at night and transforms into something else, which is textbook left-hand path stuff. This is a cool parallel to Tosen's holification as well, which is greatly implied to have been achieved through the use of Aizen's complete Hogyoku, which in of itself is a huge parallel to the Almighty as they both stem from the Soul King. On the other hand, Uryu inhabits the role of stagnation. His entire arc in the 1,000-Year Blood War is about clenching tightly onto what he has in the present. His choice to join Yhwach's army is not driven by the Quincy's collective desire to see change, but rather by his own personal ideology which antithesizes them, to protect the current world for his loved ones are living within it. Unlike Yugaram, who fully embraces Yhwach's vision, Uryu is completely opposed to the eradication of the existing order. His role as the right-hand representative of stagnation is reinforced symbolically through the still silver arrow. While Yhwach did refer to Yugaram as his right arm over 1,000 years ago, Uryu was placed in an even closer position, not only being made his successor but also being granted the same letter A as Yhwach himself, as opposed to Yugaram's B. Much like Tosen and Gin, Yugaram was the devoted follower while Uryu the traitor, waiting for the right moment to strike. And this can be extended to Mimihagi, who arguably betrayed the Reo upon developing its own will. Once again, I want to emphasize that it ultimately does not matter which hand you assign to which character. This was one of the hardest sections of the video to write because I kept shifting between interpretations. Both sides have compelling arguments, but ultimately I realized it just doesn't matter. The parallels between Tosen and Yugaram are undeniable and self-explanatory, and the same can be said for the parallels between Gin and Uryu. That is the most important takeaway from this section. Characters in a narrative do not exist in isolation. They are extensions of the larger framework they belong to, both informed by and informing the ideologies, ambitions, and subconscious reflections of the figureheads at the center. This goes for most stories, but Kubo seriously champions this idea in his approach to structuring the cast of Bleach. Characters are not just independent entities, but rather facets of a greater whole, reinforcing and expanding upon the thematic core of the groups they exist within. To view them in isolation is to miss the depth of their purpose. Each one serves as a narrative lens that reveals more about the figure at the top of their group, or just the group as a whole. For example, in the Gote 13, each squad operates as its own microcosm, a reflection of the captain's philosophy and style. Squad 11 perfectly exemplifies this aspect of Kubo's writing. Under Zaraki, a captain who revels in raw combat and rejects the need for subtlety or restraint, the squad has become synonymous with brute strength and fearlessness, and the two most prominent characters within this framework, Ikkaku and Yumichika, subtly mirror Kenpachi's own contradictions. Despite their reputation for straightforward battle, both hide significant aspects of their true power. Ikkaku conceals his Bankai to stay under Kenpachi's command, while Yumichika disguises his Kido-based Zanpakuto ability to align with the squad's ideals. This mirrors Kenpachi's own journey of suppressing his true strength and self for the thrill of battle. When it comes to Aizen and Yhwach, Kubo pushes this aspect of his character writing to its absolute extreme. The Espada under Aizen and the Sternritter under Yhwach are all deeply connected to their leaders. They embody aspects of their leaders' philosophy, fears, desires, or even just general character stuff. Sometimes this is an intentional aspect of their design. They are consciously crafted in this way by their ruler, and sometimes these connections emerge as unintended manifestations of their influence. Their very existence speaks to the ideology that binds them together, making them integral to understanding the true nature of the one who stands above them. The Espada are the main forces under Aizen's command, ranked in order of their lethality, with the lowest numbers signifying the most powerful threats. This hierarchical structure is more than just a means of classification and typical power scaling for plot purposes. It is a direct extension of Aizen's philosophy, where power alone dictates value. He has shaped Hueco Mundo into a brutal meritocracy, a world where strength is the only currency and competition is the natural order. The Espada, despite being a collective force operating under Aizen's command, are deeply individualistic, and they are encouraged to be that way by their king. Each of them prioritizes their own ambitions, perspectives, and personal codes over any sense of camaraderie. They are the furthest thing from a unified army. Instead, they exist as a collection of powerful predators kept in check only by Aizen's overwhelming presence. Beneath the Espada are their Fraction, hand-picked subordinates whose main purpose as characters within the story is to reflect their respective masters. Just as the Espada are fractured representations of Aizen, the Fraction serve as fractured representations of the Espada they serve, reinforcing their leaders' beliefs, mirroring their strengths, or amplifying their weaknesses. This layered structure creates a hierarchy built on mirrors, Aizen at the top, the Espada beneath him embodying different facets of his nature, and the Fraction replicating those same dynamics on a smaller scale. At their core, the Espada are defined by their assigned aspects of death, each representing a fundamental concept tied to mortality. These aspects are not just symbolic, they shape each Espada's worldview, powers, and even their ultimate fates. As Arrancar, hollows that have ripped off their masks in a paradoxical attempt to regain their humanity, they exist in a state of contradiction, creatures of hunger and loss seeking meaning in a cycle of destruction. In this sense, they are perfect extensions of Aizen, individuals striving for something beyond their nature, yet doomed to remain trapped within it. The most consistent symbol throughout the Arrancar saga is the crescent moon, which is representative of enlightenment in Buddhism. It's also one of the main symbols associated with Aizen through his Zanpakuto, Kyokusugetsu, which references a famous Chinese idiom about the reflection of the moon on the water's surface. It's illusory and ultimately fake. Aizen plays the role of God to the Arrancar. He uses the Hogyoku to forcefully evolve hollows into Arrancar, which is an allegory of forced enlightenment. And it's quite obvious that this enlightenment is a farce. Almost every single Arrancar fail to overcome their nature by breaking free of the hollow condition and conquering their respective aspects of death, hence why the crescent moon is flipped. The evolution given onto them by Aizen is futile, reflecting his own false enlightenment through the use of the Hogyoku on himself. Hollows are beings who fear regression, as that would lead to a loss of individuality, and thus they seek constant evolution to hold on tightly to who they are. They exist in a very simple world with a single rule: might makes right, the law of the jungle, a dog-eat-dog world. Aizen's rule of Hueco Mundo came with a single law: do not bring down the sky of Las Noches, but beyond that, do whatever the hell you want to do. In the realm of hollows, everyone is permitted to be their true selves. It is the polar opposite of Soul Society's fixed community. But these are hollows, beings of pure instinct whose hearts became their masks upon transformation. They are endlessly trying to fill the voids in the place of their heart. They lack a core, a foundation in their identity. Even after ripping off their masks and becoming Arrancar, a false symbol of enlightenment as they regain reason and become rational beings once more, they are still cursed to an endless pursuit of progress. They are still searching for who they are. And all of this describes Aizen perfectly. Aizen is exactly like a hollow. He fully understands the world around him, but is cursed with eternal progress because he lacks a core. He lacks a firm basis in his identity. He can see through everything except himself. He has convinced himself that reaching the top of the world will fill the void within his heart and complete him, just like a hollow. I have discussed the hollow condition in depth in other videos, such as my breakdown of the Arrancar power system, or my analysis of Ulquiorra and Yhwach's subtle dynamics, so I won't retread familiar ground. Instead, I want to examine how the Espada, through their aspects of death and general characterization, function as extensions of Sosuke Aizen. Arrancar's ability to absorb and assimilate others mirrors Aizen in several ways. The most literal example is the Hogyoku, an artifact Aizen failed to perfect on his own, leading him to steal Urahara's version to complete the gem that would go on to replace his soul. A subtler example would be Aizen's metaphorical consumption of Shinji. He devours and replaces Shinji, assuming his position as captain of the 5th Division. This is further supported by the lie Aizen tells the Soul Society about his Shikai ability, which is eerily similar to Shinji's Bankai ability. Arrancar's manipulation of Rukia, pretending to be a friend in the appearance of Kai and Shiba, also mirrors Captain Aizen's deception. The greatest ability Arrancar ever acquired belonged to Metastasia, which was a creation of Aizen. Both characters are driven by an endless desire to become more than what they were born as, but their reliance on external sources of power ultimately proves to be their undoing, with Arrancar's use of Kaien's body strengthening Rukia's resolve, and the Hogyoku Aizen stole, rejecting him in the end. Zairoporo represents Aizen's scientific ambitions taken to an extreme. His pursuit of perfection mirrors Aizen's own attempts to become a transcendent being and replace the supposedly perfect Soul King. Yet, while Zairoporo's attempt to acquire perfection in the form of immortality is a failure, Aizen succeeds, literally becoming immortal. Zomari reveres power and control above all else, yet he embodies hedonism and self-indulgence, a contradiction that defines him. The way Zomari describes his ability is almost identical to Aizen's later speech on reliance, that all things are subservient to another. They both attempt to prioritize control over everything, yet they are incredibly indulgent and constantly succumb to their desires. Aizen loves to indulge in the world around him. He revels in playing with his food, even when it might better serve his interests not to. There are countless examples of this all throughout the story. For instance, he literally keeps Gin by his side despite knowing of his inevitable betrayal, simply out of curiosity for how the boy would attempt to take his life. Grimmjow is obsessed with proving he is the king. He is defined by his rejection of authority. This is perhaps Aizen's most predominant motivation, as he explicitly outlines in the final battle. Crushing those who try to control him is always the only reason he takes action. Grimmjow's entire character arc revolves around the chase for transcendence, constantly pushing himself towards evolution in an attempt to become a Vasto Lord. This mirrors Aizen's own journey of self-actualization as he refuses to be bound by the limitations of Shinigami and seeks greater heights. In a nutshell, both characters embody a relentless drive to carve out their identities on their own terms. Noitara despairs over his own perceived weakness and puts on a facade of being the strongest to mask deep-seated insecurities. Aizen despairs over having no equal and puts on a facade of never needing any connections. Noitara's desperation to validate himself and lash out at the world through violence is a more exaggerated, self-destructive version of Aizen's quest to validate himself through power. He scorns trust and reliance. He cuts away at all potential bonds. He aims to stand alone at the top. Ulquiorra's nihilism is Aizen's philosophy distilled to its extreme. They both view the world as fundamentally empty. However, Ulquiorra ultimately convinces himself that the absence of meaning is simply the way things are. He accepts this state of the world. Aizen rebels against this notion. His quest for transcendence is not just about power, but about seeking fulfillment through that power and creating meaning in a world where there is none. Kubo explicitly links nothingness to a lack of self-awareness, making Aizen arguably the most spiritually empty character in the series until the Thousand Year Blood War. Haribel is one of the few Espada who embodies selfless strength, valuing loyalty and protection over power for its own sake. Aizen's view of sacrifice is mostly utilitarian. He sacrifices others to further his goal, seeing them as expendable, including Haribel herself. However, his pursuit of a new world order and utter commitment to a lonely path of bloodshed could be seen as a sacrifice in its own right. Ironically, Haribel achieves what Aizen sought by reaching Ryokyu and meeting Ichibe, standing at the literal top of the world as the representative of Hueco Mundo. Baragon represents decay and the inevitability of death. His character is deeply concerned with the idea of godhood, what it means to be divine and lose that position of power, to go from a king to a pawn in the army of the one who usurped your throne. He embodies the purest form of death itself, senescence or death from old age, which Aizen conquers through achieving immortality. His rule over Hueco Mundo is a symbol of the stagnant world Aizen seeks to destroy. Like Yamamoto, he is the living embodiment of his culture's history that Aizen feels the need to strike down with his own hands. However, Baragon is defeated by his own power, and the parallel to Aizen there speaks for itself. Stark is Aizen's most obvious reflection among the Espada, and that's why he's number one. His strength is so overwhelming that it kills those around him, leaving him utterly alone. This reinforces Aizen's belief that to stand at the top is to be alone. Aizen crafts an image of superiority that keeps others at a distance, refusing to acknowledge or embrace any equals. Stark, on the other hand, longs for companionship. He splits himself in two in an attempt to escape loneliness. He constructs a friend, similar to Aizen's goals for Ichigo I previously covered. The character of Stark is Aizen's internal struggle laid bare, the part of himself he is unwilling to confront and admit. Yami, ranked both 10 and 0, represents Aizen's suppressed rage. Aizen's journey began and ended with rage. His rebellion against Soul Society was fueled by his frustration with the world's stagnancy, and in his final moments, he erupts in a fury when faced with Kisuke Urahara's calm indifference. Rage is simultaneously the least significant of Aizen's key character traits and the most important in certain circumstances. That is why Yami is ranked both 10 and 0, which is an aspect of the Espada's makeup that I believe almost exclusively exists to reflect Aizen and his rage. The placement of Yami's final scene coming immediately after Aizen's defeat feels very deliberate to me, both forming a heart with the one they previously viewed as beneath them, Aizen with Ichigo and Yami with the dog. Each Espada embodies a facet of Aizen: his hunger for power, his scientific ambition, his obsession with control, his rejection of authority, his facade of power, his rebellion against emptiness, his view of sacrifice, his fear of stagnation, his loneliness, and his rage. Their ranking reflects the importance of these traits, with Stark's loneliness at the forefront and Yami's fury lurking beneath it all. The Espada are not merely Aizen's subordinates, they are pieces of himself that Aizen desperately tries to cut away and leave behind. Despite his bid to surpass the Soul King, he was stuck imitating him through constant self-mutilation. In essence, he symbolically rids himself of those aspects of death in an attempt to affirm his position as a god. And that doesn't just go for the Espada, he cuts away all of his ties to the mortal world. Momo, Toshiro, Yamamoto, Tosen, Gin. This is all in stark contrast to Yhwach, who hoards everything and takes them into himself. The Wandenreich and the Stern Ritter are, in many ways, the polar opposite of Aizen's empire. Viewing them side by side illuminates several key juxtapositions: individualism versus collectivism, chaos versus order, progression versus stagnation, fake versus real. The only distinct similarity between them is their narrative functions as extensions of their leader. The Stern Ritter are Quincy warriors handpicked and empowered by Yhwach himself. Unlike the Espada, who are ranked by strength in numerical order, the Stern Ritter are all on the same level. Each is given a shrift, a letter of the alphabet corresponding to a unique ability, making them not separate individuals vying for dominance, but parts of a collective whole, a singular army operating under their god's will. The Wandenreich is an empire of absolute unity, where individuality is renounced and personal ambition is irrelevant. This distinction is further emphasized by the fact that Yhwach is also part of the alphabet system. Unlike Aizen, who deliberately separates himself from the Espada, placing himself outside of their hierarchy, Yhwach is both above the Stern Ritter and within them. He is A, the first letter, the origin, and the core of the Wandenreich's power. He is not just their leader, but the very source of their strength and identity. The Stern Ritter do not exist as independent beings, they are merely pieces of Yhwach given form. While the Espada are individuals pursuing their own ambitions under Aizen's omnipresent gaze, the Stern Ritter are a true army, a hive mind bound together by shared purpose and obedience. They do not have their own subordinates like the Fraction, nor do they seek personal gain. Each Stern Ritter is an equal soldier in Yhwach's vision, their power determined not by personal evolution, but by his will. I am not saying they are incapable of exhibiting personality, there is literally a rebellion in the middle of the arc, but these are ultimately meaningless deviations. They cannot escape the grasp of their father and the ironclad system they exist within. When Yhwach reclaims what he has given, they simply cease to exist. At their core, the Stern Ritter are defined by their shrifts, each representing a core principle of Yhwach's dominion. Their identities are dictated by the letters they bear, making them living symbols rather than true individuals. They do not own their abilities, they are merely temporary vessels for Yhwach's will. Where the Espada are bound by their hunger and personal struggles, the Stern Ritter are bound by their duty and their lack of autonomy. The Espada are trapped by their own nature, the Stern Ritter are trapped by Yhwach's control. The Espada try and fail to define themselves in a world ruled by power. The Stern Ritter cannot even attempt to define themselves, because Yhwach has already done it for them. However, as I established earlier in the video, Yhwach's identity is discordant, and this reflects onto his followers. Having derived their identity from someone who has deep flaws in his own identity, the Stern Ritter are riddled with contradictions. One of the first instances of disharmony in Yhwach's identity is presented through Royd Lloyd, who takes on Yhwach's image and fights Yamamoto in his stead. He functions as a quite literal extension of Yhwach, right at the start of the Thousand-Year Blood War, nudging us readers to look closer into Yhwach's identity, relationship with the Stern Ritter, and establishing the manner in which he will be written. While Yhwach does not have a lot of explicit characterization, Kubo puts a lot of time and effort into crafting his dynamics such that they not only characterize him, but also multiple other characters throughout the story. Yhwach is a melting pot of all of the story's most pertinent concepts, and much of this is achieved through the Stern Ritter as his extensions. Now, there are over 26 Stern Ritter, so I won't be going over each and every one of their connections to Yhwach, as that would not only be time consuming and very challenging, but ultimately redundant for the purposes of today's video. The main point of this is to illustrate that Aizen and Yhwach are written using very similar frameworks, with their underlings serving as their extensions. I'm gonna handpick some of the most pertinent examples because even within the story, only about half the Stern Ritter are genuinely significant characters. I'll try to sprinkle in a couple of the less significant ones because even they have thematic value and function as extensions of Yhwach in their own right. Kubo didn't include these characters to simply fill up space. Well, besides the three that Kenpachi kills off screen, nobody can convince me that those guys aren't there just to fill up the alphabet. Yugaram is possibly the most explicit example among the Sternritter of Yhwach's extensions. He has similar powers to Yhwach, associates his entire worth to his ability to be of service to Yhwach, and he takes on the mask of the ruler, aka the Almighty, during nighttime. The balance and ability of assigning fortune and misfortune is widely considered to be an attribute of God, something Yhwach is constantly doing throughout the final arc as he redistributes life and power between his followers. Lily Barrow is God's masterpiece, and for good reason. There is no Sternritter who embodies Yhwach's godly nature as profoundly as Lily, who is literally considered a god of his own, given that Shinken Hakkyoken goes on to reflect his power. Yhwach describes the awakening of the Almighty as having opened his eyes, and the Almighty is an ability which surpasses logic. No weapon he has faced can harm him. This is pretty much identical to the X-axis once Lily opens his left eye. At that point, no weapon can harm him but his own. No logic can apply to him, and once he opens his left eye 3 times, which is the same number of pupils in Yhwach's Almighty, he can remain practically invulnerable for the duration of that battle. The manner in which Lily is defeated, having his own power reflected onto him, also reflects Yhwach's defeat and the Still Silver Arrow. Mask the Masculine is one of my favourite examples, the superstar who draws power from cheers of his fans. However, as you may already know, Mask is not actually the Sternritter, but rather a creation of James. Unlike Gremmy, whose creations worship him as their god, James worships his own creation, cheering from the sidelines until eventually he is consumed by the superstar he created. While many of Yhwach's Sternritter unintentionally and subtly mimic him, Mask is one of the most overt parallels to the Quincy King, and just generally one of the most purposefully overt characters in the entire story. The manner of his creation mirrors Yhwach pretty strongly. Both James and Yhwach were people who needed to create their heroes, seemingly isolated from others to cope with their isolation. They made creations who would overtake their identities and eventually become symbols that they not only projected much of themselves onto, but would eventually supersede their own identity and meaning in life in the eyes of others. For a story so defined by iconography, it's definitely not a coincidence that with all of these similarities in mind, Mask and James both also share Yhwach's signature icon of the star. Gremmy stands out among the Sternritter. Although none of the Sternritter are superior or even equal to Yhwach, Gremmy's shrift positions him as a creator. He is introduced trialing his own creation just as he would go on to be trialed by Yhwach, who is watching the battle against Kenpachi closely, as it is largely implied that Gremmy would have been chosen as the 4th Schutzstaffel member instead of Askin if he did not die. Gerard is literally the heart of the Soul King who refuses to die and constantly keeps coming back through miracles. He keeps cheating death and refuses to die, similar to Yhwach towards the end of the final fight. This trend of cheating death is actually a constant among all of the Royal Guard, some of the closest Quincy to Yhwach. Driscoll's shrift, the overkill, is essentially just Yhwach's condition presented in a much more direct manner. The more they kill, the stronger they grow. Although Yhwach transcends this with not even having to do the killing himself. He gets stronger by simply being surrounded by death. Asnot is a direct representation of Yhwach's fear of death, which is further supported by his Volstandic's power operating through the optic nerves. Giselle's shrift functions similarly to the Ashvalen, with revival being at the forefront of both abilities. Both are enforced through blood, both can heal limbs, both can redistribute things between people, so on and so forth. Bambietta is an extreme representation of Yhwach's fear for closeness. She is the self-imposed group leader of the Bambis, who is not necessarily respected by her followers, but thanks to her immense power, they follow her all the same. The Explode is an exaggerated response to fear, blowing up everything around Bambi and not letting anything get too close. Nyanzol is another representation of Yhwach's fear for closeness, with his shrift, the Wind, being permanently active and preventing anything from getting close to him. This is made very blatant by Yhwach literally keeping Nyanzol hidden within himself to make use of this power. Pepe is a similar example to Giselle, the twisted mixture of love and ruthless exploitation that Yhwach showcases again and again. When he performs acts of cruelty upon his followers, Yhwach does not view it that way. There is so much more to be said on each and every one of those examples, as well as all the Sternritter I didn't mention, such as Askin's inability to die and the death dealing allowing him to control the lethal dose doses of any substance including reishi, and how that ties into Yhwach's existential condition and own powers, or how Bazz-B is after Yhwach because he took everything from him, which is the same reason Yhwach is after the world, or how Nanana's ability works by observation and how everything the Almighty sees cannot be used to harm Yhwach, but we'll be here all day if I continue to list out these minor connections. I don't want to miss the forest for the trees, as we're mainly concerned with how this ties into Aizen. Each Sternritter embodies a part of Yhwach, and while this was metaphorical in Aizen's case, it is very literal in the case of Yhwach. They are entirely codependent, requiring the other to exist, and Yhwach has domain over their souls. When Lil Toto calls him out for taking their powers and performing the Ashvalen on all of the Quincy below the Ryokyu, Yhwach's response is completely genuine. He does view them as comrades, he does think of this as helping one another. They are expendable to Yhwach in the same way that clipping his nails or cutting his hair would be expendable. He doesn't believe he's doing anything wrong. There's nothing cruel or unnatural about taking from his children and giving the power he gave to them to some other children. It's like rearranging his own body parts. This is just the natural order of serving under a god like Yhwach. They are all chess pieces to be moved around. Just as he performs the Ashvalen on the Sternritter he left behind to revitalize his royal guard, he goes on to perform the Ashvalen on the royal guard to bolster his own power. Unlike Aizen, who tries to cut away the Espada to affirm his position as a god, Yhwach takes the Sternritter into himself for the same reason. I want to take a closer look at how both Aizen and Yhwach function as authors within the narrative and how their characters interact in this regard. To put it simply, Aizen builds out a framework for himself in his aspirations for godhood. In the context of the story, he is the first, the original author. Although this framework he builds out is one he is entirely incompatible with, for he is human and cannot rid himself of this humanity. Yhwach, with his introduction, steals this framework, but is also perfect for it, which ties into their respective roles as orchestrators. As Aizen's poem outlines, gods are all imitations of humans in the context of Bleach. This applies rather literally in the context of Aizen and Yhwach's dynamic. I think it's safe to say, even without the anime edition outright confirming it, that Aizen always knew about Yhwach. In episode 6 of Core 1, he tells Yhwach that he knows his name from multiple sources. He even knows the Wandenreich by name. A question I've always had is, why did Aizen make his move when he did? After at least a century of plotting and scheming, what was the trigger for him to finally make his move? Was he waiting for Ichigo to reach the right age? That's a plausible answer, but I propose an even better one. Aizen chose the time he did to betray the Soul Society and enact his plan to kill the king, precisely because he knew Yhwach was coming in a very short while. The Kaiser Gesang prophesizing Yhwach's return shouldn't be too difficult for Aizen to discover. This is the same person who uncovered the biggest secret of the world, the original sin. So Aizen makes his move, which lasts the entire duration of pre-timeskip from chapters 1 to 423. I've briefly covered in previous videos that Bleach is structured into two distinct halves that mirror and complement each other. Pre-timeskip is Aizen's script that Ichigo shatters, and post-timeskip is mostly Yhwach's script that Ichigo also shatters. The best way to establish Aizen as a character with authorial power is to look at how strongly he resembles Ichibe, the most explicit example of authorial power within the narrative. I would argue that Ichibe exists as the maximization of what Aizen mistakenly wanted to be. The control over the Soul King, the ability to script up someone's identity, the Orken in his bones, the deity figure of the Shinigami, the one who defines the reason of the universe, so on and so forth. All of the things Aizen wanted would have placed him in the same position that Ichibe occupies, even if they couldn't be more different in terms of philosophy and worldview. Aizen is also strongly inspired by the Bodhisattva Aizen Yhwach, whilst Ichibe is literally just a bodhisattva of his own within the context of the story. Aizen taught calligraphy in the Shinigami Academy, and Ichibe is Mr. Brushman, who literally weaponizes the ink of the manga itself. The Shinigami under Ichibei each have chapter covers with their names written in his ink, while the Arrancar under Aizen each have chapter covers with their names written in the Latin alphabet, which is yet another tie to Yhwach, who does the same with his shrifts. I've always wondered whether the Quincy not having covers like the Shinigami or Arrancar was a conscious choice from Kubo or not, because it ties into their lack of individuality pretty perfectly. Instead of having chapter covers with their names, they have title cards introducing them with their shrifts given the most focus. Anyways, back to Aizen and Ichibei. Even the fact that Aizen's attire and general design is predominantly white, especially once he undergoes the Hogyoku transformations, is a very interesting detail when considering Ichibei and how the two would interact. One of my favorite moments of indirect communication between these two characters, if you could even call it that, is how they both apply the stepping on ants motif. Against Renji on Sokyoku Hill, Aizen states it's difficult to step on ants without crushing them, and against Yhwach, or rather Kuroari the black ant, Ichibei of course steps on him. There are a lot of other connections between the two, but I won't bore you with excessive details and get down to the point. From this perspective, Ichibei vs Yhwach is sort of like if we got to see pre-time skip Aizen vs Yhwach. Yhwach's victory against Ichibei here, but lost to Aizen later on, speaks volumes from this angle, and how much Aizen has changed over the time skip. Using the same perspective, Ichigo vs Aizen is sort of like Ichigo vs Ichibei. Actually no, it goes deeper. Ichigo vs Aizen is sort of like Yhwach versus Ichibei, as Ichigo quite literally takes on the appearance of the Quincy King with the use of the final Getsuga. We'll talk about this a little more later on, but just some food for thought. Something incredibly impressive about Aizen within Bleach's universe is that he forces himself into a similar position as Ichibei and Yhwach, as the figurehead of one of the main races in the cosmos. He reaches the highest plane, he becomes the pinnacle of one of the main races. His creation ends up dwelling within Ichigo's soul. All of these details places him on the same level as Yhwach, who is a natural born god, despite Aizen just being a random Shinigami. Another very fascinating similarity between Aizen and Yhwach is how they build off of the previous main antagonist. Byakuya throughout Soul Society is foe Aizen, and Ginjo throughout Fullbring is foe Yhwach. While Gin keeps attention away from Aizen by putting it all on himself and serves the role of Aizen's cover-up in a literal sense, Byakuya is more closely linked with Aizen in the narrative sense. He functions as a surrogate antagonist until Aizen's schemes are uncovered. He's the big bad of the Soul Society arc, the main obstacle that needs to be overcome, only this is all a part of Aizen's illusions. Just like everybody else, Byakuya is a pawn on Aizen's chessboard, moving exactly how the orchestrator wants him to. Byakuya is the main antagonist only because Aizen needs him to be. The main thing that put me on this train of thought is how Byakuya expresses philosophies that are deeply tied to Aizen's character. In his battle against Renji, he refers to the tale of the monkey and the moon. That which shines in the eyes of the beast is but the moon reflected on the water. The monkey and the moon tale, where monkeys mistake the moon's reflection for reality and fall into a trap, is not only one of the main inspirations behind Kyoka Suigetsu, but mirrors Aizen's schemes as a whole. Ironically, Byakuya, who verbalizes this tale to chastise Renji, is himself a monkey being deceived by Aizen's illusion. Byakuya's role as a metaphorical foe Aizen is not limited to him simply taking on Aizen's imagery either. Their respective battles against Ichigo are chock full of parallels. The idea of miracles shows up in both fights, with Ichigo performing the impossible time and time again. I'll let the parallels speak for themselves on the screen. Ginjo and Yhwach also share some key similarities. The entire Ginjo traitor reveal functions as a prelude to the truth of Old Man Zangetsu, this mentor figure in Ichigo's life hiding deep dark secrets about their identity. However, unlike Aizen's double identity, which was all just an act, both Ginjo, under the effect of Book of the End, and Old Man Zangetsu are not pretending, they are genuine friends to Ichigo. Execution's base is located in Naruki City, which is where Everything But the Rain takes place, and both of these characters in their first interactions with Ichigo make him question his own family, and how much he actually knows. The biggest similarity between the two is how they raise Ichigo like a pig for slaughter, giving him power with the underlying intent to take that power for themselves. Ginjo stealing Ichigo's Fullbring and Yhwach stealing Ichigo's Reiryoku are almost one-to-one as scenes, which is one of the reasons I absolutely adore Tsukishima stepping in immediately after the latter and giving Orihime the pathway to repair Ichigo's blade and fight for the final time. Kisuke and Ichibe's parallels in relation to Aizen and Yhwach are honestly quite simple. They both serve as the closest thing to an equal to the main villains. Kisuke in intelligence and knowledge, as well as being one of the only other people to know about the original sin, and Ichibe in his godly stature, the leader of the Shinigami who sits at the same position as Yhwach, at the top of their respective races. The entirety of pre-time skip can be described as a chess match between Kisuke and Aizen, and the entirety of post-time skip can be described as a chess match between Ichibe and Yhwach. While not as explicit as Ichibe, Kisuke is one of the ultimate status quo defenders in the entire story. His Bankai is literally reconstructing everything it touches. His final chapter, 666, is titled Empty Puppet Temple, which evokes the Soul King, who he is a staunch protector of because the world would crumble without its existence. Everything he does is for the sake of the Seirete. In other words, he will go to any lengths, including allowing Ichigo and Yoruichi to die, if it is for what he perceives as the greater good, the sustenance of the universe. Kisuke and Ichibe are both the emblems of stagnation that opposes the progress both Aizen and Yhwach are fighting for. Gin is one of the few characters whose heart and intentions Ichigo wasn't able to grasp through the exchange of sword swings. Gin wasn't looking at him. His heart wasn't in the fight as somebody who wanted Aizen dead, who desperately wanted Ichigo to succeed deep down. This prevented Ichigo from understanding him at the time of their exchange. Unlike Ginjo, who to Ichigo it felt like there was a lid on his soul concealing his true nature thanks to Book of the End, Gin's heart was locked away. And yet, despite that, through the simple act of locking eyes with him, seeing Rangiku crying over his dying body, Ichigo fully comes to comprehend Gin's intentions, in turn being entrusted to finish the battle in Gin's stead, becoming the god-slaying spear that finally cuts down the insurmountable moon. Uryu lived his entire life misunderstanding his father's intentions. He mistook the dissection of his mother's corpse as the job of a doctor, swearing that he would never become a doctor himself if that's what was demanded of them. Upon learning the truth in the form of the still silver arrowhead, the father and son finally come to an accord and bridge their misunderstandings, which is why Uryu becomes a doctor at the end of the story, despite swearing he never would. He learns that his father was carrying out the job of a Quincy, not a doctor, interring his own wife's corpse, to retrieve the silver in her heart and form the arrow that would be instrumental in taking down her killer. The Hogyoku and the Silver Arrow function almost exactly the same, a product of the villain's own creation that reflects their hubris and ultimately serves as the bane of their existence. And even more importantly, these are objects formed from the hearts of Rangiku and Katagiri respectively, strengthening the parallels between Gin and Uryu. Even the theme of silver that's present very explicitly for Uryu is also present for Gin in his very name. Although Gin is not written in kanji, it's a very clear double entendre. Even just Gin embarking on his revenge-driven suicide mission so that Rangiku won't have to cry anymore, ending with Rangiku crying over his dying body, is an irony that is incredibly similar to Uryu saying he would never become a doctor, only to end the story as a doctor. There's probably far more to be said on Gin and Uryu, but once again, I don't want to miss the forest for the trees. One of the most explicit contrasts between Aizen and Yhwach lies in their respective treatment of the Gotei 13's first Captain Commander. Yamamoto is Aizen's only special threat, the only person Aizen creates a specific strategy for, whilst Yhwach barely pays any mind to him and chastises him by specifically not including him among his 5 special threats. Aizen creates a hollow specifically to seal Yamamoto's Zanpakuto because he may not be able to deal with it himself, while Yhwach uses Roid to buy time while he goes and has a quick chit-chat with Aizen, despite being the only one who can control Yamamoto's power. Any of the Quincy could have theoretically stolen Yamamoto's Bankai, however only Yhwach could control its immense power. Both exchanges end with Yamamoto on lower ground, lying on the floor defeated and looking up at Aizen and Yhwach respectively. Aizen forces the Captain Commander to sacrifice his own body and tank the full weight of his own power to protect Karakura Town, leaving him in a crater on the ground. But while this is a defeat for Yamamoto, the exchange actually ends with him landing a significant blow on Aizen through Itokaso. In exchange for his arm, Yamamoto makes up for the sealing of his Zanpakuto with a Kido Sword of Flames, a final gift before Ichigo swoops in and takes over the the battle. While this isn't a really good performance for Yamamoto and he does lose this battle against Aizen, he is still portrayed as an absolute monster. Aizen had to plan meticulously to take down this man, and he shows him a great deal of respect in how he speaks to him. On the other hand, Yhwach, already having killed Yamamoto, rubs it in further by blowing his body up into a massive crater, making these visual similarities carry through. Yamamoto's power once again threatens the surrounding environment. However, unlike the scenario in Fate Karakura where Aizen's scheming uses Yamamoto's powers against him, this is something Yamamoto personally succumbs to in his rage. He willingly puts the Soul Society at risk of destruction because he wants to enjoy slaying Yhwach by his own hand. Yamamoto created a fire blade out of Kido when his Zanpakuto was sealed, whilst Yhwach drops his actual sword and summons a Quincy arrow to use as a blade just to mock Yamamoto further, showing that he doesn't even need his sword to slay him. The first invasion in general is chock full of callbacks and inversions of that section of Fate Karakura, with Ichigo's entrance immediately after Yamamoto's defeat serving as a good example. Aizen tells Ichigo he has known him since he was born and gets cut off by Isshin just before he can tell Ichigo that he's a Quincy, and Yhwach completes that for Aizen by dropping the bombshell reveal in this mirror scene. Byakuya sends Ichigo to Fate Karakura and tells him his duty as a substitute Shinigami is to protect the town, even going as far as to say nobody in the Gotei 13 would require help from someone like Ichigo, which the first invasion completely inverts, with Ichigo being their last ray of hope and Byakuya, a captain of the Gotei 13, begging Ichigo to protect the Soul Society. I would actually describe the thematic framework of the Thousand-Year Blood War as a battle between the philosophies of Aizen and Yhwach. On the topic of metafiction and characters with authorial power, it's important to note that Ichibei is defeated right before Aizen is unsealed from the Muken. And perhaps even more importantly, Aizen is unsealed immediately after the death of the Soul King. Shunsui and Ukitake are a great example of opposites attract, and this portion of the story in volume 68 is the perfect example of that, with Ukitake unsealing the right hand of God representative of stagnation at the exact same time as Shunsui unsealing Aizen, the self-proclaimed God representative of progress. Why it is so important that Aizen returns to the story after almost 200 chapters of absence in this particular moment is because this portion of the Thousand-Year Blood War marks a massive transition for the story and for the world. With Ryo's death and Yhwach's consumption of him, this is a redefining of the cosmos with a new linchpin at the center of it all. With Ichibei's defeat and loss of power for the remainder of the manga, this is a redefining of the narrative. The position of quote-unquote author is up for grabs, and the two main candidates to replace Ichibei in this position are of course Aizen and Yhwach. With the final chapter, we all know who wins this battle, as Aizen delivers the thesis of the story in response to Yhwach's dying words. Something I have recently considered is that White and Old Man Zangetsu are representations of Aizen and Yhwach respectively, although both Masaki and Isshin play a role in their constitution and have obviously influenced them in very noticeable ways as well. For today though, I'm going to place bigger focus on how they relate to Aizen and Yhwach. But since almost every interaction between Ichigo and his Zanpakuto spirits are so widely misrepresented, I want to really take my time to very thoroughly examine a few of these interactions, because all of them are some of the most important layered scenes in the entire story, with several valuable things pertaining to Aizen, Yhwach, progress and stillness. First, some groundwork. Who are these two spirits? White is an artificial existence, a product of science that was passed down to Ichigo's soul from Masaki, who had undergone holification through merging with Aizen's creation, whilst Old Man Zangetsu is an entirely natural existence stemming from the presence of Yhwach's blood within Ichigo, that also comes from Masaki as his Quincy parent. However, there is a flip side to this dichotomy, since White merges with Ichigo's natural Shinigami powers coming from his father Isshin, whose soul was bound to Masaki's while he remained powerless in Ikigai, all of his spiritual energy serving as a cage to keep White at bay, which it would continue to do until Ichigo steps out of the shattered shaft. Over these 20 years of contact with Isshin's Shinigami powers, 15 of which spent in Ichigo's soul, White became his true Zanpakuto, the real Zangetsu, whilst the old man goes on to function as a parasite, a spectre of Yhwach who steals White's name and pretends to be Zangetsu. The final villain very literally exists within the protagonist's soul through Old Man Zangetsu, and that piece of him steals the name of Ichigo's natural Zanpakuto, turning itself into the center of his soul until White's powers increased beyond control and he became dominant over the old man. The first time Ichigo enters his inner world, he is greeted not by White, but by the visage of Yhwach. As Aizen and Urahara's game of chess takes the forefront, with the latter training Ichigo to send him to Soul Society and clean up his own mess, a much greater game of chess lingers in the background. Kisuke is well aware that Aizen's schemes for Ichigo are in motion. Having prevented Rukia from aiding against the Menos Grande he knew Aizen had dispatched, hence why that battle was so necessary, to prepare Ichigo for the challenges that await him. Shortly after, he discovered and destroyed the bug that Aizen had planted to tip off Rukia's location. This is the war of manipulation and mind games that spans across the entire pre-timeskip. Two scientists competing through experimentation on the most spiritually gifted being in the cosmos, the main character himself. But these are scientists, manipulators. Yes, they're powerful, and yes, they're extremely intelligent, but those powers are limited, at least until Aizen fuses with the Hogyoku. Behind the thick veil of Kisuke and Aizen's mind games, there is an even greater war brewing between literal gods. Ichibe and Yhwach, with their medium influencing incomprehensible powers, whether it be governance over the black ink of the manga itself or the futures of the characters within it, exist on an entirely different plane to the warlords of pre-timeskip. These two don't need to have an active presence in Ichigo's life or even the story itself for their war to show up within the depths of his soul, with Ichimonji censoring Yhwach's name as this fragment of him introduces itself to Ichigo. Surprised, the boy does not recognize his king. Yet as he one day goes on to describe, he is Yhwach and he is not Yhwach. The same way this guy might have come from this guy, but they're not the same person. They've been transformed through spiritually bonding with Masaki and Ichigo. The old man manifests physically within Ichigo's soul and sees the world through his eyes, eventually coming to understand the boy's anguish and developing a hatred for the rain he knows he is personally responsible for, his original self having produced the rain on that fateful June 17th. Old Man Zangetsu represents another path for Yhwach, one where being caged in Ichigo's soul for 15 years changes his perspective and moves him to his core. The 1000-Year Blood War begins with Ichigo's empathy and steadfastness winning the final villain over, inverting the typical formula with instances like Renji, Byakuya, Grimmjow, Ukiura and Aizen, forming a heart not by clashing blades like those examples, but by literally becoming his blade. And although this officially happens in chapter 542, it was in motion for a very long time. By the old man's second appearance, he is already working with Ichigo's true Zanpakuto spirit to train and protect him. All it takes is a single line for the spectre of Yhwach to become a protector of Ichigo. Fighting for its own sake is meaningless. Survival in itself is meaningless. I want to win. I want to win. This simple display of courage that transcends all fear of death is what wins over Old Man Zangetsu's heart and allegiance. Of course, he's still controlling things as the center of Ichigo's soul, holding back the boy's true power and wanting to keep him away from conflict for fear his original soul, i.e. Yhwach, will one day kill him. He's also still wearing the name of his Zanpakuto and only giving Ichigo access to a fragment of the power he could not contain. But upon witnessing this display of Ichigo's courage, he now supports him, even if he hasn't come clean to him just yet. I imagine a great deal of the transformation from Yhwach of 1,000 years ago to Ichigo's protector comes from the name, as ultimately in The Blade Is Me, it is Ichigo embracing him as Zangetsu when that is not who he is that allows Ichigo to possess two Zanpakuto. Names carry great power, and in The Blade and Me, Ichigo calls out Zangetsu's name in reference to the old man, materializing his iconic Shikai, which is actually just the fragment of Ichigo's true Zanpakuto that the old man couldn't contain. We literally see this happen as Ichigo's inner world rains down as boxes of Reiryoku, and he detects his Shinigami powers among them, red among a swath of white. The spirit ribbon mechanic is quickly outdated as Reikaku is a far superior form of spiritual observation, however it is very well utilized in symbolically depicting Ichigo's power development through his character design. Ichigo reaches for the box with the red ribbon, the color for Shinigami, in turn receiving the fragment of his true Zanpakuto OMZ couldn't contain. But interestingly, when Ichigo materializes his Shikai, it is wrapped in a white ribbon, with red having a very understated presence as only the sword strap across his chest. It's still there, Ichigo wears his power of course, but the white is so much more dominant in his Zanpakuto design, white being the color of human/Quincy spirit ribbons. The old man is Zangetsu at this moment in time as the center of his soul. It may not be the actual truth, but Ichigo's belief in that makes it the current truth. That is the power of names in Bleach. That's why 60 chapters later during the Bankai training, it's not white, but the old man that is summoned and externalized when Ichigo stabs the Tenshin Tide doll. Had this happened after the Byakuya battle, I believe white would have been externalized, but for now, OMZ remains the center. White is an Asauchi that Ichigo was born with, capable of that function because Aizen created the hollow by layering countless Shinigami souls, the same process Nimaya uses to construct what he calls the ultimate Zanpakuto that can become anything. This is especially noteworthy when looking at the Kenpachi battle and the inner world sequence that takes place. Let's closely observe what actually happens in the dark side of the universe number 1. Time freezes for Ichigo and the old man uses a Quincy shadow to take him to his inner world and battle with White. Ichigo questions why the world is at an angle, whilst the old man remarks on the world's stability, at the same time ignoring Ichigo. It's treated as a joke, but this is key. They are of two minds, which isn't what you'd expect from a Zanpakuto. And Ichigo is absolutely right to question the setting, which is literally synonymous with his heart and soul, located in the center of his chest. Everything about it visually and mechanically is designed in correspondence with his soul. It sinks when Ichigo is consumed by despair over the course of the Arrancar saga, and we see that happen in an instant in The Blade and Me too. Ichigo isn't being told the truth about the nature of his own soul by the people within his soul. He is clueless about himself, and that is captured visually, with the mindscape literally being tilted on its head. What comes next is absolutely crucial. Zangetsu throws a naked sword at Ichigo and calls it an Asauchi, a nameless Zanpakuto for low-ranking Shinigami. This is a name and mechanic we don't hear again for another 413 chapters. And while it's more likely that this blade is just a construct of reishi that Quincy can create, it does function similarly to an Asauchi in application. White appears wielding Ichigo's Shikai blade, and upon clashing it switches with the mock Asauchi. Remember, Asauchi are essentially the ultimate receptors of the soul, blank slates that form a unique Zanpakuto through extended contact with a Shinigami, by having that Shinigami's soul poured into it. So this scene kinda does mirror the functionality of an Asauchi. Still, White is pretending just like the old man. They are both putting up a performance to ensure Ichigo survives as they battle for dominance over his soul. The old man desiring self-preservation stemming from a fear of death, and White desiring acceptance and connection with his master. Sound familiar? Everything leading up to Deicide is a tug of war between these conflicting presences within Ichigo's soul who never engage each other directly, instead competing for Ichigo's love. What's most essential to keep in mind is that the behavior they exhibit is somewhat shaped by Ichigo's perception of them. The way they are characterized in his mind influences them intimately. Similarly to how names carry immense power, Ichigo's beliefs as king of this world also seems to have a strong influence on things. Ichigo thinks the old man is Zangetsu and thus he fulfills that role, functionally serving as a Zanpakuto spirit even though that's not his natural role. Ichigo thinks White is a destructive hollow and he too fulfills that role, although not without cryptically communicating his intent hidden under his performance. White chastises Ichigo for how he has approached his relationship with Zangetsu, a very clever misdirection. A first-time reader would naturally assume he means Ichigo's relationship with the old man, depending on him entirely without making an effort to communicate with him. Ichigo knows the Zanpakuto spirit is the reflection of one's soul, like a best friend you're born with, and White builds off of this. Zangetsu is capable of so much more. If you'd opened up your heart to him a little, he'd have become even stronger. Remember, this spirit is the fragment of Ichigo's Shinigami and hollow power that OMZ couldn't contain, and while he's complying with the old man's performance and playing the crazy hollow, White's words are all about himself. It's incredibly ironic that he criticizes Ichigo by asking if you can become best friends with someone just by asking their name, when Ichigo's failure to do so for him is the reason why he's in so much pain. OMZ stole his name. This one moment way back in his introduction is the cause of everything. The real Zangetsu just wants to be accepted by Ichigo. He wants to form a connection with him. He may appear mad and battle crazed, but so does Ichigo at times. The desire for the power to protect bred a love of battle within him that he must reconcile over the course of the Arrancar saga. Seeking power and seeking battle are synonymous, and so just like Ichigo eventually becomes a monster to protect Orihime, so too does White play the monster to protect his king. For self-sustenance, for love, out of instinct, to survive and push away death, for any number of reasons, and all the reasons Ichigo would do the same, for White is the true extension and reflection of his soul. This is where Aizen and Yhwach finally come back into the picture. I've been rambling about Ichigo's Zanpakuto spirits for a while now, but like I said at the start of this section, this is because I believe they both exist as representations of Aizen and Yhwach. That's not their sole or even main purpose, but it's there, and it serves as a fantastic lens for observing their dynamic. The old man is obviously an extension of Yhwach, leaving Aizen with White, and their connections are never ending, starting with the obvious fact that Aizen's research is what led to the creation of White in the first place. Aizen is an individual who craves and pursues progress, to break beyond the inherent ceiling all beings exist under, striving towards the top of the world, and in order to accomplish this, he sought power through experimentation, and his work could be split up into two distinct yet similar branches, holification and the Hogyoku. Both involve taking in a foreign soul to sublimate one's own soul, the integration of an exterior source of power. Essentially, they are artificial evolutionary processes, and that obviously stands in contravention to what Bleach promotes, which is inner strength and a complete acceptance of the self. You can sort of think of both the Hogyoku and holification as taking steroids, a shortcut to your desired result that is ultimately more focused on the cosmetic aspects than the substance. It's superficial, only concerned with the appearance of things and ignoring what lies beyond the surface, what lies within. Very quick tangent, but I don't want this to be taken as a criticism of steroids. I'm far too ignorant on the matter to have an informed opinion on it, but it's an analogy that I think communicates my point well enough. The hard work and discipline that goes into building a strong body, or the self-awareness and conquering of fears that goes into wholly accepting yourself to reach the peak of your power, that isn't present when you're taking in a foreign substance that does the work for you. Aizen didn't have the strength to look within. He didn't have any equals to color his perspective. He didn't form a heart with another which would have given meaning to his own, so he turned to science, ultimately stealing the work of the closest person he had to an equal and pushing them away as well. This obsession with appearances isn't limited to his scientific endeavors either. In fact, it's one of the most crucial aspects of him as a person. This is the man who spent over a century playing a character, convincing the people he is gearing up to conquer that he is a kind, gentle voice of reason, a protector. And when he finally lifts off that mask and begins treading on the path of no return, he is still wearing another mask. He just doesn't know it yet. All of his pontificating about trust being a burden, how he needs nobody but himself, how he needs to exist on his own pedestal as the one everybody relies on at the top of the world, for that is how gods are born. All of it is a desperate attempt to convince himself that he doesn't need anybody. It's all textbook escapism. He pretends to be all-powerful in the eyes of all, whilst lacking the power to look himself in the eyes and accept that he is incredibly lonely, and try to truly understand who he even is. Yet there are cracks on the surface, holes in this character he plays. Whether he knows it or not, Aizen's yearning for a bond presents itself in several instances, albeit rather well concealed. He literally chastises his captain for not getting to know him well enough. In an alternate universe, had Shinji overlooked his suspicions and actually tried to befriend his lieutenant, perhaps Aizen could have turned a new leaf, and we never would have had Bleach. His bizarre dislike of Toshiro likely stems from a deeply rooted envy, for the boy is very much like him, a prodigy of great power whose gifts isolated him for many years, only he was fortunate enough to be freed from that loneliness through bonds formed with Rangiku, Hinamori, and eventually so many others. While it's a far more abstract comparison compared to Yhwach and Old Man Zangetsu, Aizen and White are just incredibly similar, man. White's entire plight is that OMZ stole his name and he just wants to be accepted by Ichigo. Fundamentally, he is a lonely soul who wants nothing more more than to be understood and accepted, and he plays a character. He fulfills the role of the crazed hollow his master thinks he is, just like Aizen, who is constantly playing a character, both the kind, caring captain of Squad 5 and the superior being who is needed by everybody but himself needs nobody. And just like the Hogyoku that Aizen fuses and replaces his soul with, White is an amalgamation of countless souls. The page that actually tipped me off on this dynamic is the only conversation we ever get between White and Old Man Zangetsu without Ichigo's presence. Raise him well, because his power will eventually be mine. I honestly don't think I need to explain how that reflects Aizen and Yhwach. There are several more connections between the two, but I have to just accept that I won't be able to cover them all, or I'm not going to be uploading a video for many more months to come. Beginning of the Death of Tomorrow is the title of volume 15 and chapter 127. On the cover of the volume, we have Kira surrounded by pure blackness, imagery that is starkly reminiscent of both Ichibe and Yhwach. Black is form, especially in the realm of manga. Both the visuals and the text exist as black ink on white pages. This is integrated into the story rather explicitly through the introduction of Ichibe's Zanpakuto. His control over black itself, as well as his position as the one who named all things, essentially translates to control over the narrative itself. But Ichibe is defeated by none other than Yhwach, and in doing so he steals control of the narrative from the monk. The Quincy King assumes authority over the story. He becomes the walking embodiment of fate. Yhwach supersedes Ichibe as the author, not through control over names, which is limited to the past and present, but through control over everybody's future. And this is reflected in the visual presentation, the overwhelming black, the dripping ink. And this volume cover of Kira, a character who goes on to die and is brought back to life by Mayuri through the process of having his soul stitched back together by the souls of his dead squad mates, turning him into an amalgamation of souls, not so different to Yhwach himself, is incredibly reminiscent of Yhwach simply in its overwhelming use of black ink. But that's a very weak argument on its own. The real meat lies in the title of the volume and its corresponding chapter. The Death of Tomorrow is Yhwach's dream in a nutshell. The perfect utopia he envisions, the world without fear, without life or death, is a world with no tomorrow. Why keep track of time if you're immortal and never going to die? The very concept of a tomorrow assumes a future that is different from today, shaped by the actions and struggles of the present. In a world without death, there is no meaningful distinction between today and tomorrow because nothing truly changes. There is no need to measure time. The title of volume 15 has clear ties to Yhwach and the ultimate thematic conflict of the story: progression versus stagnation, life and death. Even the chapter cover has the title punctuated with crosses. But the most valuable thing for the purpose of this video is in the actual events of the chapter. 127 begins with the spectre of the one who will one day be stamped by Ichigo, dragging him to his feet. Old Man Zangetsu is training Ichigo to acquire Bankai, and with context from the later story, we know the Bankai Ichigo acquires is merely a fragment of his true power. It's still functionally a Bankai, it's just not the full picture. On top of this, the process through which Ichigo acquires this Bankai is incredibly unusual, with the only other person to have used this method being the very person who devised it, Kisuke Urahara. A Tenshin Taidol, which I mentioned earlier, is used to forcibly externalize the Zanpakuto spirit, i.e. OMZ, who functions as the center of Ichigo's soul for the time being, and Ichigo has 72 hours to battle and defeat the spirit, ultimately achieving Bankai. OMZ is left to choose the method of battle, and this is where one of the greatest nuggets of Kubology is concealed in the early story. A great number of blades are summoned, and OMZ claims only one of those blades are the real him, and that he can only be defeated by that sword. All of the blades here are pieces of Ichigo's soul, and only one of them can be used to defeat OMZ to acquire Bankai, which can further be extrapolated onto Yhwach, who is defeated by a very similar sword to Ichigo's false Shikai from the pre-time skip. It's obviously not the exact same blade, but it is very intentionally designed as a callback, with Yhwach's vision of the future and his own death corroborating this by presenting Ichigo in his pre-time skip Shihakusho, wielding the original iconic Zangetsu with the white wrappings. Some very cool setup here in the 15th volume that isn't paid off until the final 74th. However, we're not here to talk about foreshadowing. This is Old Man Zangetsu's final appearance until chapter 541. He does show up for a brief flashback we see in the battle against Byakuya to tell Ichigo the name of his main attack, which he learnt from White. However, that's just a part of his Bankai training. And he also appears in the form of Tensa Zangetsu, which we'll talk about a little later in the video. This is important. This timing is important. This is where Old Man Zangetsu effectively steps away for good, and the method he chooses for the Bankai training is especially interesting in this context. He fills the area with countless blades, all of which are fragments of Ichigo's soul, and as we later learn, Ichigo's Zanpakuto up until the 1000-year Blood War is merely a fragment of his power that OMZ could not contain. Looking at this mechanically, it's no different to Ichigo's first inner world sequence where OMZ transforms the surroundings into countless boxes of reishi, with only one of them containing his Zanpakuto. In other words, the fragment he could not contain. It's definitely not a coincidence that the process through which Ichigo acquires Shikai and Bankai are very similar in theory. From this point onwards, White has become the center of Ichigo's soul, which essentially means that if Ichigo were to stab the Tenshintai doll following his battle with Byakuya, or at any point after acquiring Bankai, I believe White would be summoned into the outside world, not Old Man Zangetsu. Fast forward about 80 chapters and we arrive at one of the most iconic sequences in the entire story. Ichigo's holification training and interactions with White. At this point in the story, Ichigo is absolutely terrified of the hollow within him. He refuses to open up his soul to him. He refuses to connect with his Zanpakuto spirit. He is consumed by a fear born of ignorance. In this sequence of Ichigo fighting against Hiyori, we see a mouth opening to coincide with White's takeover of Ichigo's body. The exact same visuals are used much later on in Everything But the Rain, as Masaki feels White calling out for help within her soul. The contrast between these two scenes, Ichigo and Masaki's opposite responses to the hollow's cries, illustrates the former's ignorance pretty perfectly. Once Ichigo learns the truth that was staring him in the face all along, he adopts the same mindset as his mother and embraces the hollow as a part of him. Upon entering his inner world, Ichigo questions where Zangetsu is, obviously referring to the old man, and the real Zangetsu replies, "I'm right here." It's hidden behind the evil glare, the sadistic smile, but this is White genuinely trying to confide in Ichigo. He is trying to communicate and tell him the truth. I am Zangetsu. How many times do I have to tell you? I am Zangetsu. The analogy White uses to describe the relationship between himself and OMZ is very crucial. The two share the same body, as we have known for a while. However, as their relationship changed, so too did their appearance. When life rules, flesh covers the bones. When death rules, the bones become exposed, life being OMZ and death being White. This analogy carries on to Ichigo's true Bankai, with its outer shell coming from the short sword or Quincy blade originating from OMZ, in other words, the flesh of his blade, and the interior coming from the big sword or Shinigami/hollow blade originating from White, in other words, the bones of his blade. The iconic speech from White, the difference between the king and his horse, does seem to be the ramblings of a mad hollow at first glance. But in his own twisted, dysfunctional way, this is White's attempt at protecting Ichigo by helping him grow and progress. While there's obviously far more nuance than this, the speech can be boiled down to might makes right, power rules above all else, which is just Aizen 101. And on a related note, the imagery of a king and his horse can also be found in this page of Yhwach. Finally, we arrive at the climax of the Arrancar saga, the Deicide mini-arc. Two enlightened beings come to a head, as Aizen's soul itself is replaced by the Hogyoku, and Ichigo relinquishes everything for a brief taste of transcendence that will allow him to protect the world. As Aizen steps out of nature toward the edge of reason where he will redefine the very laws of said nature, Ichigo steps into it, into the depths of his soul, searching for the answer that will provide him the power to save the day, the final Getsuga Tensho. Old Man Zangetsu, in the form of Tensa Zangetsu, refuses to teach Ichigo this technique because what he wants to protect is not the same thing as what Ichigo wants to protect. Yhwach's appearance and age reflects his power. We know that he would regress into the blackened baby we see in chapter 565 if he were to lose all of his power. This is why his spirit within Ichigo's soul, who calls himself Tensa Zangetsu, appears younger. Over the course of the Arrancar saga, Ichigo has drawn from the power of his true Zanpakuto, White, meaning the spirit of Yhwach within him has grown weaker and therefore younger. This spirit refuses to teach Ichigo the final Getsuga, for what Ichigo wants to protect is not what he wants to protect, and he explains himself by showing Ichigo the state of his inner world, in essence the state of his soul. What was once a towering world filled to the heavens with hope has been reduced to a tiny little town. The rain that once poured down on the world may have stopped, but now it's been sunk to the bottom of the ocean. This is a very fascinating scene with many different things to glean, but above all, I think this represents Yhwach's utopia and his character in general. The rain has stopped, the town is peaceful, but there's no room for hope or progress. It's utterly stagnant, reflecting Ichigo's loss of hope and inability to move forward. And the cherry on the cake is that this is a young visage of Yhwach himself lamenting this fact, having been fully won over by Ichigo's courage. Then the spirit reaches for Ichigo's chest, specifically the location of the soul, and pulls out the very roots of his despair. Young Yhwach refuses to let Ichigo become jaded like himself. Black spiritual energy is pulled out of Ichigo's soul and manifests into white. No longer does he share a body with Yhwach's visage, he dwells within Ichigo's soul as the center of his power. The two spirits merge as one, not because that is their natural state as they claim, but because Ichigo requires full access to all of his power in order to utilize the final Getsuga, and that power has been limited by OMZ's backseat meddling. So in a sense, they are now both the center. An equilibrium has been reached, albeit momentarily. The tug of war between the two spirits has come to an end, as while he still does not know the entire truth, Ichigo finally understands that the hollow within him is a part of his very soul, not just a byproduct of the trials of the shattered shaft as he'd always assumed. And thus, Ichigo finally accepts all parts of himself, including the hollow he had been rejecting for so long, being stabbed through the chest by the fusion of his two inner spirits in a warm embrace that fully juxtaposes the manner in which he pushed the hollow away at the start of this saga. And in this 3-month-long exchange of sword swings within his soul, all Ichigo felt flowing from Tensei Zangetsu's sword was loneliness, just as he would go on to feel the same from Aizen in their battle. If white is the combination of Ichigo's Shinigami and Hollow powers and Old Man Zangetsu is Ichigo's Quincy powers, then this form, this final Getsuga Tensho that is achieved by embracing this trinity should naturally be a combination of all three. While its root may be in the Shiba family, making it a Shinigami technique, Ichigo is not just a Shinigami, which makes his variation of the final Getsuga a Shinigami technique, a Hollow technique and a Quincy technique all in one. However, the dominant aspect aesthetically is the Quincy aspect. He is wearing a glove like Uryu did when performing the Let Steel, which, just like the final Getsuga, is a sacrifice of one's spiritual energy by pouring all of it into one catastrophic attack. In this official artwork, Mugetsu literally looks like Ichigo is shooting an arrow. And the most damning evidence of it all is how much he resembles Yhwach, covered in black aura with long black flowing hair and of course the red eyes, even in the official artwork colored by Kubo himself. As I said earlier, one could say Ichigo became Yhwach to defeat Aizen. I've spoken about the Blade as Me in various videos, and seeing as it's one of the most beloved and respected moments of the story, I don't think I need to go over everything about it again. Ichigo learns the full truth and accepts both the spirits within him as Zangetsu. Interestingly, the mirror moments of 396 and 619 that I spoke about towards the start of the video have a third scene that follows a similar pattern, a recounting of Ichigo's journey thus far from a different perspective. Aizen framed Ichigo's journey as one of progress that he had orchestrated, climbing in power through several battles towards a result that would serve Aizen's interests. Yhwach framed Ichigo's journey as something set in stone. The script had always been written from the very beginning, and it would inevitably lead Ichigo to Yhwach. And following Everything But the Rain, Isshin frames Ichigo's journey as one of choice. He tells him the events leading up to his birth, that he couldn't have had any choice then, and then follows that up with, you know the rest. The things that have happened since you were born are things that you've experienced. You don't need me to explain that. In doing so, Isshin affirms Ichigo's Ichigo's free will. He provides him with the true script of his life, one that came about thanks to his choices. The authors of Fate tried their hardest to impose their own scripts onto Ichigo, and they come dangerously close to succeeding. But at the end of the day, Ichigo's resolve breaks through. No matter how much they try to convince him that he is an instrument bending to their will, he is a human being with autonomy, a moral agent capable of making his own individual choices. And then we have The Blade Is Me. When we say that iconic title out loud, there is no emphasis on is, but in the presentation, Kubo highlights the word by giving it a distinct style. And there's an obvious reason for this. The title does not exist in a vacuum. It's a follow-up to the previous title, The Blade and Me. Even the sketches of the two chapters correspond, with Old Man Zangetsu appearing in the former and Old Man Zangetsu leaving in the latter. The is in The Blade Is Me almost looks carved on, as if to forcibly change the title and redefine the truth. This is Ichigo tangibly interacting with the medium itself, changing the title of a chapter in the manga he exists within. In other words, redefining the script of his life, turning a Quincy spirit which functionally has no business being a Zanpakuto into one half of Zangetsu. Later on, when facing Yhwach, Ichigo reinforces this further by referring to the spirit of the man he is fighting that dwells within his soul as Old Man Zangetsu, right to his face, rejecting the script imposed upon him. Another way this is reinforced is with Old Man Zangetsu, aka Yhwach, serving as the regulator of Ichigo's powers. He's not always the center, as there is a constant battle for control between himself and White. However, even if he's not the center, up until The Blade Is Me, Ichigo is still using a limited amount of his power, with the rest of it being suppressed by the spirit of Yhwach, since he hasn't acquired a Zanpakuto in the proper fashion. And as we progress through the story and Ichigo progresses in power, we see Ichigo level up in forms, from Shikai to Bankai to Holification to Fullbring. Even the final Getsuga Tensho can be considered a form that was shaped for him by his Quincy spirit. However, upon reaching enlightenment and finally existing on the same plane as the scriptwriters, tangibly affecting the fabric of the manga itself, just like the gods of the narrative, Ichigo's power is no longer limited by fixed forms. That isn't to say he doesn't have a Bankai or the Horn of Salvation, which is similar to Holification, because he does, but he is not limited by those forms. This is one of the reasons his brief battle against the Bambis is one of my favorite Ichigo sequences in the entire manga. Ichigo's freedom is perfectly exemplified by how he uses his powers, which can only truly be described as formless. A mini Getsuga Tensho, a Getsuga Jujisho, or even a Getsuga Tensho mixed with a Grand Rei Zero. A fitting power for one born from a fusion of so many things. You want to know what started all of this? What the source of my endless brain rot over these two characters is? I mean, they interact on screen only a single time, at least within the official true canon version of the story, you know what I'm saying? It's actually the chapter titles of the final volume. I want to give a brief breakdown on every one of these chapter titles because there's a lot of cool shit to extrapolate, and I also ask you guys to leave your own interpretations in the comments below because I've never seen anybody talk about them. 675, or Blood for My Bone. Yhwach keeps telling Ichigo he's his father, while Ichigo tries to use Yhwach's Reiatsu to tip his inner equilibrium and wake up his inner hollow. This is very simple. He's trying to have contact with Yhwach's Reiatsu, and his powers are all blood related, to wake up the hollow within him, the bone, the inner shell of his Zanpakuto, if you remember what I said earlier. 676 and 677, Horn of Salvation 1 and 2, those are simple enough, I don't need to explain them. 678, The Future Black. My mind immediately goes to Ichibei because of his volume poem, The Future, Pitch Black, Upside Down. This is when the true power of the Almighty is unveiled, and I guess there's some conceptual overlap with Ichimonji there. Complete dominion over others. Ichibei can overwrite your identity, Yhwach can use your own future against you. 679, or The End. This is one of my absolute favorite chapter titles in the series, despite it being so simple. With my reading of post-time skip as a whole functioning as a sort of response or follow-up to pre-time skip, the final battle functions as a mirror of Deicide, the final act of the Arrancar saga. only this time it's an actual god that is being killed. Deicide number 17, the end, was only a prelude. This is the real end, hence why the end is in brackets or parentheses for you Americans watching. 681, or the end to world. This is where it starts to get really abstract and confusing. In this chapter, Yhwach descends from Ryoku to the Seirete. We get Orihime and Tsukishima bringing two reality warping powers together to override the Almighty, and Yugaram's final scene with Uryu. The title is a continuation of The End, as it's following up Ichigo's blade being broken with its restoration, and Tsukishima creates a second world by manufacturing a past where the blade was never broken. I hope that makes sense. 682, or the two-sided world end. Aizen and Yhwach's battle begins, and both of them have at one point in the story represented the cogs of fate Ichigo is trapped within, what you could call a world end for him, and a two-sided one as they are in opposition fighting against each other in this chapter. 683, or the dark side of two world ends. The dark side of the universe chapters are always related to white. This is the chapter where Aizen takes up the role of bait and sets up Ichigo's explosive entrance with a Getsuga Tensho. Since this is the chapter Ichigo officially joins the battle, it supports the reading that two world ends are Aizen and Yhwach respectively, and Ichigo's arrival is signified by the dark side joining this climactic battle. 684, or the blade, is simple enough. Ichigo is running on an empty tank of Ryoku, completely depleted by Yhwach a few chapters ago, but he keeps going. Even when his Bankai blade is shattered, another blade emerges from its core. The blade is Ichigo, his indomitable drive and unyielding persistence. 685, or the end of flawlessness, a callback to the perfection speech, which is incredibly pertinent in the following chapter as it lines up with Aizen's speech on courage. The end of Yhwach is the end of the perfect world he sought. 686, or Death and Strawberry, is a bookend as Ichigo's story comes to a close with the same title as the very first chapter. The story begins anew, with Ichika's meeting with Kazui that is presented in the same way as Ichigo's meeting with Rukia. There's a lot going on there that probably has nothing to do with the goal of this video, but I did promise we'll be going unnecessarily deep into some rabbit holes, so I thought why not. The dark side appearing in these titles had led me down the rabbit hole that led to the creation of this video, so I wanted to try and squeeze this somewhere into the video itself. However, the final battle functioning as a mirror of Deicide is an idea I want to explore a little further. What makes this tricky though is that the final battle is chock full of callbacks spanning across the entire story, not just Deicide. Yhwach essentially embodies every challenge Ichigo has ever faced and throws it at him. He shows him true despair and pierces a hole through his chest like Ulquiorra did. He steals his power and laughs maniacally in his face like Ginjo did. And on the flip side, there are callbacks in how Ichigo overcomes this challenge. Tsukishima stabs him through the back and aids him in regaining his blade, his power, just like Rukia had done for him prior. But structurally, the final fight is post-time skip's counterpart to pre-time skip's Deicide, the climactic act with the fate of the world on the line as Ichigo goes face to face with a god. For the sake of my own sanity, as I've been working on this video for several months and really just want it to be done at this point, I'm going to be listing these connections in a very raw, matter-of-fact way because trying to present it in any other way will genuinely drive me insane. Both Aizen and Yhwach are undergoing dramatic transformations towards the end of their respective sagas that are fundamentally linked by the Soul King. Aizen experiences several stages of rapid evolution culminating in the monster form, which is all facilitated by the Hogyoku, a wish-granting jewel that was created using fragments of the Soul King. Yhwach literally replaces the Soul King by consuming him alongside Mimihagi, becoming the new cornerstone of the cosmos in his father's stead. Upon completion of the chrysalis stage, Aizen enters the Dangai, leaving Ichigo in Fate Karakura. He tells him, "I can devour you when this is all over." Of course, he is simply trying to instill fear into Ichigo since he views fear as necessary for evolution, and immediately after saying this, he goes on to kill the Kototsu specifically to grant Ichigo the perfect opportunity to evolve by making use of the Dangai's time mechanics, expecting the boy to arrive with an even greater power. Yhwach goes about this very differently, although the presentation is very similar. He steals all of his power from him. Where Aizen nurtures, Yhwach takes for himself. And so instead of him traveling before fighting Ichigo like Aizen did, Yhwach traverses through the Garganta after already having devoured his son. Aizen strips away his closest comrades by personally killing Gin and Torsen. Yhwach does the same by performing the Ashvalen and stripping them of their power. This one is much looser, but I'm including it just because it's funny. Ichigo tries to run back the iconic facepalm against Yhwach, but he fails. Yhwach's destruction of Ichigo's Bankai is very reminiscent of Ichigo destroying Kurohitsugi, the ultimate display of both Ichigo and Aizen's transcendence smashed into pieces. Fear and resignation in the face of both Aizen and Yhwach's overwhelming power takes the life out of Ichigo's eyes. This is a very explicit thing in Deicide, which Gin comments on upon Dangai Ichigo's entrance. However, it's present in the final battle as well, with the light reappearing in Ichigo's eyes after having his sword repaired by Tsukishima and Orihime. The Hogyoku and Silver Arrow serve almost identical roles in facilitating the downfall of the main villain, a product of their own creation that reflects their hubris and ultimately serves as the bane of their existence. The Hogyoku was created by the souls of Rukongai residents as well as fragments of Reo, and the Silver Arrow was created by the silver left in the hearts of Ashvalen victims, fragments of Yhwach's impact. The forms of sword combat also plays a significant role. In the Arrancar saga, Ichigo learns to see his sword as an extension of himself, thus fusing with it as a result of his character arc. Aizen almost steals this from him and fights Ichigo while also fused with his sword. However, unlike Ichigo, whose combination with his sword represents a major step in his path to enlightenment, Aizen's fusion is falsified and represents a false sense of enlightenment. In the Thousand Year Blood War, Ichigo's arc revolves around him embracing his dual heritage, gaining dual swords as a reflection of his character growth. In the final fight, Yhwach proceeds to steal this element from Ichigo and also utilizes dual wielding, claiming it to be not just a privilege reserved for Ichigo. It is particularly interesting that Yhwach's dual blades are Quincy weapons, as all Quincy weapons are created by their user. They are manifestations of their will. His blades, being an extension of himself, parallel Ichigo's, but unlike Ichigo's, which symbolize meaningful self-acceptance and growth, Yhwach's do not represent any significant character arc or realization. Instead, his dual wielding is purely mechanical, lacking the deeper personal transformation that Ichigo undergoes. The final Getsuga Tensho, crumbling away, is mirrored by the outer shell of Ichigo's blade crumbling away. Both are representations of the Quincy side of his power. This next one is one of my favorite connections in the entire story. Aizen assumes Ichigo's image and role against Yhwach, seemingly against his own knowledge, as he says, "I see, so I appear to you as Kurosaki Ichigo." Aizen literally becomes Ichigo to assist in defeating Yhwach, just as Ichigo became Yhwach to defeat Aizen. The ultimate attacks of both fights are huge parallels of one another. Against Aizen, they are on a level playing field. Both are standing in the sky. Ichigo's final attack starts with his hand held up and he swings down, which is fairly basic symbolism. He is bringing Aizen back down to earth, and himself in a way, as this attack will sacrifice all of his spiritual powers. So we have a very vertical slice for Aizen, who is a false god trying to reach for the very top, being brought back down by Ichigo. For Yhwach, we have a horizontal, slightly diagonal slice. They are not on a level playing field. Ichigo starts on the ground and has to rise into the sky to slice Yhwach. In both instances, Ichigo swings the blade to shatter fate. There's a lot more where that came from, but I think I've covered all the main beats that exist in both of these climactic acts. I could sit here and go into the importance of each and every one of those parallels, but I'll leave that to you guys. If you do have any questions, please do ask in the comments and I will try my best to answer them. The phrase "as above, so below" originates from Hermetic philosophy and implies a fundamental mirroring between higher and lower realms, between the macrocosm and the microcosm. That which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above. This is the perfect lens for me to explore where Aizen and Yhwach are now, to bring this video on these two paradoxical yet interconnected existences to a close. Aizen is imprisoned in the Muken, which is the Japanese name for Avicii, the lowest level of the Buddhist hell, where suffering is eternal. Essentially, he is cast into the deepest, lightless pit at the lowermost point in the world beneath the Soul Society. Yhwach, in contrast, ascends to the Ryokyu, the highermost point in the world above the Soul Society. In a setting of eternal day, Yhwach is bathed in a divine light. Their positions in the cosmos would imply that Aizen is suffering while Yhwach is thriving, but there is more to this picture. As we know from Cards for Your Own World, Yhwach now exists in the exact same position as his father. What he referred to as endless humiliation is now his reality. And Aizen, who only ever wanted to end the stagnation within Soul Society by instilling a drive for evolution, is sitting idly by as the Shinigami make great strides day by day. Aizen is achieving everything he once wanted by simply staying put. However, there's a big caveat for both of them. Yhwach, in a twisted way, has gotten what he always wanted. He wanted to conquer death, and one could argue he has. He now exists outside of the cycle of life and death in a perpetual state of stillness. And Aizen is bound to a chair, stripped of his agency. He wanted to stand at the top and he's sitting at the bottom. He can observe the changes he brought about, but he cannot have a hand in it, which was more important to him than anything else. This is perfectly exemplified by this page, which at this point I think it might just be my favorite page in the entire manga, as he assumes the image and position of our main protagonist in the final battle. Aizen loses his left arm, representative of progress, and his right eye is covered, representative of stagnation. In other words, he can now only see progress taking place. He cannot bring about progress with his own hand. And there we have it, the most important dynamic in Bleach. There's one parallel that I haven't mentioned that sums up their dynamic in relation to Ichigo incredibly well. On Sokyoku Hill, Aizen slices Ichigo and comments on having intended to slice him in two. In the final battle, Yhwach, whilst fighting a Kyokusugetsu Ichigo, shatters his blade and then comments on having intended to break it clean. At this point, the blade and Ichigo are one and the same, of course. Aizen may have been pretending and never truly wanted to kill Ichigo at that moment in time, but the parallel still stands. The two scriptwriters try, time and time again, to control our main protagonist, but he just clings on. He keeps going and rejects the authority they try and impose upon him. Even if it's the smallest chance, the tiniest thing keeping him or his blade together, they cannot break him fully. They come incredibly close, and you could argue that they do break him fully in these two key moments, but that's only for a moment, and he's pulled right back up by his friends and other connections he's formed. The heart he shares with others, and the courage to keep going that he holds in himself. Ichigo is the prime representative of Bleach's thesis, and those two scriptwriters cannot change that no matter how hard they try. With that said, we have reached the end of the video. I'll be honest guys, I was a lot more optimistic about this video when I first started. I thought this was going to be the best video on my channel by a landslide, and maybe it is. A few months later, having finished writing this script, I am not satisfied. This isn't what I wanted it to be, but I had to make the executive decision to just stop overthinking and call it a day, because if I continue trying to perfect the video, not only would Mayuri haunt me in my dreams, but I would take an unbearable amount of time to finish the video, and my stubbornness would prevent me from uploading anything else until it was done, and I f***ing miss uploading. I truly feel like I've just barely scratched the surface when it comes to these two characters and their dynamic, which sounds crazy to say because I've almost lost my voice speaking into a mic for a few hours, and it's definitely an overstatement. I covered so much ground in this video, but there's still so much more to say, and I definitely intend to make a follow-up video to this one sometime in the future. Some kind of addendum to cover new ground and talk about things I struggle to put into words in this video. That being said, if you're hearing my voice right now, that means you've watched the entire video, and that probably means you enjoyed the video, which makes me very, very happy. So thank you for watching, and I am so glad to be back. I have missed uploading so much, and you can expect regular uploads on the channel on Bleach, Hunter x Hunter, a little Jujutsu Kaisen perhaps, One Piece, and whatever else I feel like discussing in a video. I hope you all have an incredible day, and I'll see you guys next time.